This afternoon, we have Josh from Global Conservation Solutions here, and he will be walking us through the conservation standards process, which DCNA has applied to their new key habitats program. So this will give us a lot of background information on how this program has been developed. As well as, it should be very interesting for everyone else, even outside of the Dutch Caribbean, because this is a international standard for developing programs. So maybe something like this might fit a program you're developing yourself. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Josh, who's joining us from Colombia, Peru. I never know where he is. Oh, maybe he's in Bolivia.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Finally. All right. Apologies, folks. We've got some technical difficulties we're trying to get sorted here.
Maybe 1 second, Josh. Are we supposed to have, are we supposed to be able to see Josh or just the slides? Okay, perfect. Okay, Josh, I think we are good to.
Okay. So I guess, first of all, I've never used this platform before. I could hear you a second ago. I can't hear you now, so I don't even know if you can still hear me. I can't see you either. So I'm not exactly sure at this point. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me? All right. Perfect. So I'm going to dive in. If our tech folks can perhaps figure out a way so that I can see everybody in the room and I can hear them at the same time, that would be really great. So there's a little bit more interaction. The screen is really small. So I do apologize, folks. We got a little bit of technical difficulties. Please bear with me as we dive in here. Another thumbs up if you can see the presentation that I have. I think I'm sharing my screen. Thumbs up if you can see that. No. No thumbs up. Let's try this again. Can you see my screen now? And I can't see you while I'm sharing my screen, so I'm going to hope that you can still hear me. This is a very strange platform. Okay, I'm just going to dive in. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time. I hope the sessions have been really good so far. Today, we're going to talk about adaptive conservation. Thank you, Jessica, for that intro. We are going to be talking about a very specific framework called the conservation standards. But before we even dive into that, we're going to do a little bit of a backstory on why this is so important. So we're going to talk about the intersection between dialogue, evidence, and strategic planning. My name is Josh Noseworthy. I am the founder and CEO of an organization called Global Conservation Solutions. And we are essentially a strategy and organizational development firm. We help organizations all around the world, whether that's the nonprofit sector, government agencies, even the private sector, forward-thinking businesses, come up with effective strategic plans to more efficiently and effectively conserve and restore nature. So being really strategic, having a clear understanding of how we're defining success as an organization, developing that roadmap to achieve success and monitor whether that success is being achieved or not. And we'll get more into those details during the presentation today. Just a few little housekeeping things. I'm not sure if there's anybody online. I can't see anybody online, so this might not be relevant. But if there are people listening online, just a reminder to keep an eye on the mute button. We have a chat box. Once again, I don't know if this is actually relevant. If there is anybody online in the audience, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Otherwise, I guess I'm just going to assume that everybody's in that room and I'm the only virtual person here. Webcams, none of this is relevant unless there's some people online, so I'm going to keep going. We are going to take a 15-minute break at the halfway mark. This session goes for, I think, 3.5 hours. Okay, so we'll take a little break, get everybody an opportunity to stretch their legs, maybe get a breath of fresh air. And I think we're also recording the session today. I'm just going to assume that our tech folks have that under control. I don't have a record button, but hopefully that will be recorded and everyone will have access to the recording after the session today as well. And like I said, my name's Josh Noseworthy. I'll skip the second introduction here. I see there are some people online. Wonderful. Okay, if you wouldn't mind just putting in your name, the organization that you represent, if that happens to be relevant, and perhaps where you're zooming in from today. I myself am zooming in from Cuiabá, Brazil, right in the geodesic center of South America and the entry to the Pantanal region. Okay, so I'm going to tell you some stuff you already know to kick us off and set the stage here. Nature is disappearing. I'm sure this is not news to anybody on the session today, but we have seen a dramatic decline in nature since the 1970s. And of course, it occurred long before that as well. Why aren't we able to really address biodiversity loss? We know these declines are happening. We even know why they're happening, and yet we can't seem to get a handle and reverse the trend. Well, one of the problems is that there is a very well documented disconnect between conservation knowledge being generated and the application of that knowledge in achieving effective conservation outcomes. This is known as the knowing doing gap or the knowledge action gap. There's a whole body of literature on this. I really encourage folks, if you're interested, to take a look at that. It's very interesting. And there are many proposed reasons for this. But there is a common thread across all of these proposed reasons, and it is a lack of effective communication between the people generating information, which usually means people within the research, the science community, and the practitioners working on the ground, getting their hands dirty, doing the work in creating and implementing actions and strategies to improve conservation. So this disconnect in communication is resulting in the inability for us to really take a lot of this knowledge being generated and to apply it. So what we know, however, is that the most successful conservation projects are consistently generating evidence that is fit for purpose. They're not just asking blue sky questions and then conducting research to answer them. They actually have management questions that, if answered, improves the practice of conservation. So the evidence being generated is fit for a specific purpose, and that requires a dialogue between researchers and practitioners. So how do we actually facilitate this dialogue so that we're actually generating evidence that's fit for purpose and allows us to close this knowledge action gap and really achieve meaningful conservation outcomes? Well, to even answer this, we first need to understand what we mean by dialogue. And we also need to know what we mean by evidence. Both of these terms can mean different things in different contexts. So before we answer the question, we're going to just take a look at these two terms and unpack them a little bit more. Starting with the art of dialogue. Dialogue is not discussion. The very word discussion, which is often what we think about when we get people in a room and we want to solve a problem, let's get everyone together and we'll discuss the issue. The word discussion has a root with the word percussion or concussion. This idea of we're just kind of like bashing ideas back and forth, and we hope that our idea sticks and that we can move on. But dialogue is actually something fundamentally different. It intentionally aims to gain insight from each other and build on a common understanding of complex ideas. So rather than trying to get our idea to be the one that sticks, we're listening to others' ideas, we're suspending our own assumptions and trying to build on all of the collective knowledge to build a better understanding of a very complex reality within which we work. So like I said, we're suspending our assumptions to explore the full depth of everybody's knowledge and experience. And this allows us to build more coherent ideas and more coherent solutions together. And we access a larger pool of that common understanding than could be attained by any individual person. So it is through dialogue that groups of people actually transition into teams, start rowing in the same direction, collectively working to achieve a shared aim or a shared goal. Peter Senge is a world-renowned system scientist and an organizational development coach. I'm sure many of people here have heard of Peter Senge. He wrote a book called The Fifth Discipline. This was a bestseller for a very long time. And he proposed 3 conditions needed for effective dialogue to take place. The first is that everybody involved has to allow their assumptions to be questioned. We can't assume we know the answer to everything. Our opinion is the only correct opinion. We have to allow other people to challenge us, to probe, and we should be able to challenge and probe our own assumptions as well and be open to those. Secondly, we have to trust each other toward achieving shared outcomes rather than furthering individual agendas. So it sets a level playing field that we're all contributing to a shared outcome. If people have alternative agendas, right, we're not going to get anywhere. So we need to get into a room together, start building trust. A lot of these processes really can go at the speed of trust only. So ensuring that we're all working together to achieve a shared outcome. And third, a neutral third-party facilitator is there to actually guide the dialogue through some sort of consistent process to avoid it just slipping back into discussion and people bashing their ideas around, or worse, and even more common, decision paralysis, where we can't move forward. So a neutral third-party facilitator is the third condition needed for effective dialogue. So we've set the stage on what we mean when we say dialogue. It's a very different thing than what most of us are probably used to, which is more of a discussion. We're going to move into how we're defining evidence now. When we think about evidence, a lot of people just have this idea that it's synonymous with science. But actually, evidence goes well beyond science. Of course, scientific evidence is a really critical piece of evidence or a type of evidence. We're talking about peer-reviewed research, experimental data, systematic reviews, modeling, et cetera, et cetera. Really critical to our understanding of the world and the reality within which we work as conservationists. But local and indigenous knowledge is equally valuable evidence. Traditional ecological knowledge and cultural practices over generations of observation and experience. Similarly, that experiential evidence from practitioners, just because it's not in a peer-reviewed paper does not mean it's not valuable. And a lot of that experiential evidence can help us drive conservation action and accelerate that action. So lessons learned from hands-on work on projects and programs. And of course, stakeholder and rights holder values and preferences, depending on the culture that you're working in, will define what even constitutes evidence in the first place. So we have to be culturally sensitive, depending on the types of projects and programs that we're developing and the place-based initiatives that we're undertaking as well. And of course, there's economic evidence as well, cost-benefit analyses, economic impact studies, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a whole group of evidence that goes beyond scientific evidence. If we limit ourselves to scientific evidence to make informed decisions about where we should take action for conservation, we're setting ourselves up for failure. We simply don't have all the answers. And any good scientist will tell you every time they do answer a question, they only end up with 10 more that need answering. This never ends, right? So when we're thinking about what evidence is, we need to go beyond this traditional sense of we need a peer-reviewed study to act on. No, a lot of other types of evidence, that experiential evidence, local indigenous knowledge, that can really help us move forward to create measurable outcomes for nature as well. Okay, so going back to our original question, how do we facilitate an open dialogue to generate evidence that is fit for purpose and close this well-established knowledge action gap? The answer is adaptive conservation planning or adaptive management. This idea that we're going to undertake a planning exercise and allow the process to help us understand what questions need to be answered so that we can take better action on the ground. Continuous learning, continuous improvement. Okay, so a little bit of a spoiler. I'm just going to jump into my take-home message right now. Conservation outcomes do not start with research, and they actually don't start with action either. They start with a foundational plan that allows us to test whether our assumptions are true about the actions and strategies that we think are going to get us where we want to go. So I'm going to give you a little story here. Some of you may have heard this one before. This is the story of George Washington. So it's 1799. Mr. Washington is out inspecting a plantation in the snow, and the next day he came down with a sore throat. The day after that, it started to get a little bit more serious. He was having some breathing difficulties, and so the estate overseer came and provided a mixture of molasses, vinegar, and butter, which I guess was common at the time. Apparently, that didn't have any effect. So he ordered Washington to remove 0.75, 3/4 of an imperial pint of blood. And for reference, an imperial pint is about half a liter. Later that morning, his personal physician arrived, applied the dried beetles to his throat, as one does, of course. Didn't see any improvement, so took out a pint of blood. Didn't see any improvement there, so he took out another pint of blood just for good measure. apparently nearly suffocated the poor man by making him gargle vinegar and water, and then took out 2 more pints of blood. Later that afternoon, another physician arrived because the situation wasn't getting better. Surprise, surprise. Took out nearly 2 pints of blood. At this point, George Washington's pulse was low, and at 10:10 p.m. that evening, he died. This is a true story. Nearly 4 liters of blood were taken out of what was, at the time, one of the most important people, at least in this hemisphere. Uh, 4 liters of blood in a single day. And George Washington was, for all intents and purposes, killed. Now, it wasn't out of any sort of malicious intent, it was strictly out of ignorance. Now, what does this have to do with conservation? This gentleman, Pierre Charles Alexandre Louis, introduced numerical methods to examine the effectiveness of medical interventions. He showed through testing different medical interventions that bloodletting is not effective. And as a result, the medical community began adapting their practices based on evidence. And we don't do bloodletting anymore when we have a sore throat. This is something that we just take for granted. We wouldn't go to a doctor and just allow them to do some sort of untested medical procedures on us. These things are tested over time to determine whether they work or they don't work. And that's what started this whole adaptive management cycle. It's been adapted by the militaries across the world. It's been adapted by natural resource managers. When we think about forestry, agriculture, adaptive management is often applied. And it's now being adopted by the conservation community. But the reality is we have a lot of catching up to do, especially if we compare ourselves to the medical community, which, as I said, this is just something we take for granted. We don't even think about it. The conservation community has been a little bit slower on the uptake of adaptive management, and there's good reasons why. It's a little bit more complicated. But I'm hoping by the end of this session, we'll have a better understanding of why it is so critical for us to be thinking from an adaptive management perspective to truly demonstrate whether the actions and strategies we implement are achieving a change in the state of nature or not, so that we can adapt our practices accordingly. So adaptive conservation is the deliberate incorporation of evidence to reduce uncertainty when making management decisions on behalf of nature. This is our working definition moving forward. And the core idea is to acknowledge uncertainty and complexity. We work in an inherently uncertain and complex world. Okay, it's not just the complexity of ecology and the changing nature of ecosystems and species populations. It's the socioeconomic layers on top of that that create the need for conservation action in the first place. We are working in incredibly complex situations. So we have to accept that we're never going to have perfect knowledge, and to design our plans to be actively and flexibly responsive as new information and circumstances emerge, rather than sticking to some rigid predefined plan. And we've all been part of this before. We developed a strategic plan. It's going to guide our organization for the next 10 years. And then 6 months later, it's obsolete because something's changed, right? We need to break out of that cycle and start thinking about planning through a dynamic living process that's always embedding new information, including the information that we're gathering through the monitoring of the effectiveness of the plan. Are we doing the right things? We should be able to say yes or no to this question. Are we doing them well? Another way to phrase that would be, could we actually be doing better? Maybe there's better ways to do this work and actually achieve even better outcomes. We should be testing these assumptions. And ultimately, are we achieving our desired impact? I think it's for a lot of people very surprising to realize how few conservation teams have even defined clearly what that impact is to determine whether they have achieved that impact or not. So this is a really critical piece to our understanding of whether being successful or not, is to actually have an objective definition of what success is. I'm going to take a pause here. I'm getting an echo of my own voice all of a sudden. Maybe a microphone got turned on. I think we solved it. There we are. Thank you very much, whoever was able to address that. All right, so that moves us into the star of the show, the conservation standards. This is an adaptive management framework that was specifically designed for the conservation community, because unlike maybe a natural resource management sector or a military or medical sector, the outcomes that we're thinking about here are very different. We're thinking about specific outcomes for biodiversity, or in some cases also human well-being as a result of healthy biodiversity. And so the framework has been adapted for that specific context. But at its heart, it is just adaptive management that's been branded for the work that we do as conservationists. Some of the benefits of the conservation standards is that it can be applied at any scale. An individual project, you can apply it at the program scale so that you can understand across multiple projects how we're faring, is success being achieved. And many organizations actually use the conservation standards for their own organizational strategic planning if their mandate is to improve the situation for a specific component of biodiversity. That's how they measure success as an organization, of a species, an ecosystem, whatever it happens to be. Consistent terminology. This is a big one. We've got a Tower of Babel situation going on. The word goal, objective, target, these mean different things in a million different contexts. We're often speaking with other conservationists thinking that we're talking the same language, and we're not at all. We're actually talking past each other because we mean fundamentally different things by some of these terms. The conservation standards was put forward as a way to hopefully start bridging that gap and ensure that we're actually on the same page when we say things like goals and objectives. Those mean very specific things. There is an almost overwhelming abundance of online resources available to support people in getting started on this journey, as well as advanced materials, and a rapidly growing network to foster collaboration. It's always improving. Version 5.0 just got released. There were some updates to terminology and process. For the most part, it's not any major changes to the standards themselves. But I guess the point is there is a body of organizations, different conservation organizations, funders, government agencies, all working together to just improve on this over time. It itself is not static. And it is recognized as a global standard at this point. There's enough evidence being generated about the success of programs and projects that have been established using the conservation standards that we're seeing an exponential increase in the uptake at a global scale. A growing library of tools to manage projects and programs. I'm going to share one with you that just got released last week. It's going to be my last slide today. And the process is flexible and customizable. A lot of conservation initiatives really require a unique perspective. And so you can kind of tailor the process to fit your needs, but the ... there is really important. As Picasso famously said, you need to learn the rules like a pro before you break them like an artist. So I hope that this presentation, for many of you who, I guess some of you may be already very well familiar with the conservation standards. For others where this might be new, I hope this is the start of a journey in becoming a pro and how to apply the tools and the principles of the conservation standards so that we can start building an evidence base as to what's working and what's not within our organizations. So as I jump into the actual standards themselves and we go through the step-by-step process, I'm going to be using the DCNA Conservation and Restoration of Key Habitats program to illustrate the output of each of these steps. So just as a highlight, I'm sure you've heard about this already, but to make sure that we're setting a foundation here, the Key Habitats program is meant to be a region-wide conservation strategy that protects and restores the unique ecosystems, which we're calling key habitats, of the 6 Dutch Caribbean islands. The overarching aims are to establish a shared conservation priorities that are aligned both regionally and locally. We want to create a strategic, actionable, and measurable program framework, and we want to strengthen ecological resilience and community engagement across the region. And if we're able to establish these 3 aims, the intended outcome is a transformative, evidence-based conservation program that is ready for launch, positioned to deliver lasting impact for nature and communities across the Dutch Caribbean. And so you're going to get to see a little sneak peek of the content that has come out of this planning process. I do want to highlight, this is not a presentation on the Key Habitats program. This is a conservation standards training for which we are using this as an example to illustrate each of the steps. So I'm not going to show you every single detail of the plan. I'm going to be pulling specific examples to draw from. So you're not going to get the full picture of the DCNA plan through this presentation. I just want to be clear about that as I jump in. Okay, the first part of this process, we think about just adaptive management, adaptive conservation in general, is to take a step back from trying to identify what we should be doing to assess the situation and make sure that everybody has a shared understanding of what the current reality is. Oftentimes, and it's a rookie mistake, there's a sense of urgency. We get people in a room and we just jump into the solution space. We should do this or we should do this. And the reality is people don't even really understand what the current the current situation is. And so we need to take a step back, ensure that we have that shared understanding of the current reality so we can use that to say what we want that reality to look like in the future. It starts with something very simple and basically just defining what the purpose is of this plan that we're going to develop together. So it establishes a shared understanding of why a plan is needed in the first place. Sometimes this is really obvious and you can get through this in 30 seconds. A lot of times, though, people might have different ideas of why a plan is needed, and it's really important to explore that. How does each team member's priorities fit within the purpose? The output of this step should be a very clear purpose statement so that you can refer back to this. Make sure that, over time, as discussions might be leaning into scope creep or you start moving into new directions, you've got this purpose statement that everyone's agreed to. This is why we're here, and it can make sure everybody stays focused and on track. So for the DCNA Key Habitats program, our purpose statement is as follows. The purpose of this plan is to safeguard nature in the Dutch Caribbean by reversing biodiversity loss across land and sea through the conservation and restoration of key habitats that enhance ecosystem services and build climate resilience. This will be achieved through regional cooperation, evidence-based strategies, and long-term community involvement, which will position the network as a leading force for conservation. Very strong purpose statement. Once the purpose statement is defined, we then need to identify, well, who's on the planning team? We think about planning team. Obviously, it's important to have the right people part of that discussion, generating that content to ensure that the plan is going to be effective once it comes time to implementation. And so the individuals involved should possess some relevant knowledge about what it is you're going to be planning around. They should also have a stake in the initiative's outcomes, and they should be capable of effectively implementing the plan. This is a really, really key one we're going to come back to here in a second. You'll likely have some initial group identified, right? Somebody said there needs to be a plan in the beginning, right? Usually it's not an individual person creating a plan. Usually there's a team. So the main purpose of this step is to ask, well, who else should be involved? Who has knowledge related to the project or the program, whatever it happens to be? Who's going to be impacted by this potentially? And we can think of that both from a positive perspective, but perhaps a negative perspective as well. The reality is in conservation, there are trade-offs, and thinking about who is going to be on the receiving end of some of these trade-offs and inviting them to the table can often be very, very helpful and to get their perspective on solutions. And arguably the most important one, who's going to implement the plan? The people on the ground, in the water, doing the work need to be at the table from the beginning, or you risk that, handing over a plan that may just not end up getting implemented. If their ideas are not embedded in this process, then you might not get the buy-in needed. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course, but all else held equal, thinking about who's actually going to implement the actions and strategies and getting them to the table early on can be a really great way to ensure that your plan has legs. And there are many ways to structure a planning team. This is just an example where we have 4 different categories. An initial team, it's usually the organization or multiple organizations that are coordinating, plus that neutral third-party facilitator. Then the core team are the people who are going to be implementing the work. They should be part of that key decision-making process. They attend all the workshops, the meetings, so that there's consistency in decision-making. Advisors might be people that are just brought in for specific topics, right? They have expertise in a particular topic and we want to get their advice. They may or may not be contributing to the broader planning initiative. And then we have participants, which is a bit of a catch-all for, really anybody who contributes, whether that's maybe external feedback on the plan, maybe we have some sort of survey to gather information. They've all contributed, but in less capacity than, let's say, the advisors of the core team. And within the DCNA program, of course, we're keeping track of everybody who's contributed. There's the coordination team as well as the advisors. And this is constantly being updated. So this is really just a snapshot. The next step, and a really, really critical step, is scope. When we talk about scope, we're talking about two things. Geographic scope, which is the clearly demarcated boundary within which the plan is intended to have a positive influence. Where are we actually trying to create some sort of beneficial outcome for nature? That should be mapped so that everyone has a shared understanding of the geography. And there's also the thematic scope, so the theme or the topic of the plan. All conservation is spatial. This is one of the biggest take-home messages and a personal soapbox of mine. All conservation is spatial. There are many ways to design these scope maps, from using GIS if you have that capacity, but if you don't, hand-drawn maps in a workshop setting where everybody can make a contribution is just as effective. The idea here is to remove any subjectivity or risk of misunderstanding as to where we intend to have a positive influence. Every conservation action or strategy ever created and implemented had a geography within which it was intended to have a positive influence. Whether that was articulated or not is another question. But there's some obvious ones: protected areas, OECMs, those types of designations have a specific boundary. But even things like education and awareness, social marketing, policy changes, those outcomes are still intended to have a positive outcome for nature in some place and not somewhere else. So having a really good shared understanding of where that area is only going to provide more clarity and focus to ensure that we're doing the right things in the right places. This is the example of our scope map for the Key Habitats program. So it is the 6 Dutch Caribbean islands, and we've mapped out to the territorial waters as well. So this is the area within which the Key Habitats program is intended to have a positive influence. Next up, we define our targets. And I will give everyone a heads up. The Conservation Standards 5.0, which was just released, I think, last month, has changed the wording here to focal values to better align with some international biodiversity frameworks where target means something a little bit different. We don't need to get into the details, but it's just an FYI. You might hear those terms and they actually are synonymous in this context. But moving forward, people are going to be using the term focal value instead of target. And what we mean by that is the biodiversity features within the geographic scope that your team is aiming to conserve and or restore. That could be an individual species. It could be a group of species. The example we have here is a black-throated blue warbler, right? So you might be creating a plan for that individual species. Maybe it represents neotropical songbirds, right? You want to create a plan specific for neotropical songbirds. It can also be an ecological community. It could be an ecosystem. Really, any component of biodiversity can be represented as a target or a focal value. It becomes the planning unit upon which the rest of the plan is developed. But we're not limited to biodiversity, and this is a really important piece for a lot of teams. We can also think about biocultural features that the team is aiming to conserve and restore. Local and indigenous knowledge, social institutions, spirituality, oral history, traditions, culturally significant sites. All of these can be included in a conservation plan if the team agrees that they're under some sort of risk or pressure, and that some actions and strategies should be developed to conserve and or restore them. So really important, not every plan has to take a biocultural lens. A lot of these plans are very strictly biodiversity focused, but we're not limited to that. And so it's good to keep that door open. A typical method, sometimes these plans, it's really obvious. We're creating a plan for a specific species. Everybody knows that. But oftentimes it's not really obvious. We know there's a landscape that's really important, and we need to come up with the basic planning units. We're going to determine how we actually address actions or create actions and strategies within this landscape to see whether the situation's improving. We still have to be specific about the biodiversity that we're trying to benefit. So it could involve just a brainstorming exercise as a starting point. What are all the biodiversity features or values of interest that occur within that scope? Then we go about grouping them together into the targets that become those units of planning moving forward. We usually start with ecosystem targets, which can often nest many different features within them. I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. And we're aiming for 8 or less, generally speaking, simply because beyond that, the plan will get so complicated that it becomes a little bit clunky. So we're trying to narrow down a total list. We don't want a laundry list of every species or every ecosystem necessarily. Try to group things together where similar strategies will benefit those different pieces of biodiversity, and we can group those together into our targets. So let's do a coastal marine example really quickly. We had a team. They came up with this list of things. We're just brainstorming, no wrong answers. Okay, we've got a ton of stuff here. We can't create a plan to try and address every one of these individually. So which of these can we group together? Because we know that at a high level, they'll probably benefit from similar strategies. In this example, they were able to group together the seabirds, and now they have a target called seabirds. They're able to group together seals and sea lions, pelagic fish, sharks, whales, coral gardens, coastal lagoons, and coastal tundra. So there was a grouping exercise. There's no right or wrong answers, right? We're just trying to narrow down this total list to a meaningful number of targets that we can focus the plan on. So in this case, they got it down to 8. For DCNA, we have 5 targets, which became the basic planning units: coral reefs, mangroves, seagrass, tropical dry forest and scrub, and tropical wet forest. So those are the 5, and these are obviously all ecosystem-based targets. Again, it is a key habitats program, so it was specifically decided. We're not doing species-based planning here. Maybe that's for another day. For a key habitats program, we really took that ecosystem lens. Next up, now that we've established the components of biodiversity that are going to form the planning units, how do we actually figure out what their health is? This is such a critical step to adaptive management. We need to establish a baseline of the current state of our targets so that we can actually say whether that state is changing over time as a result of the actions and strategies that we implement. Otherwise, there's no way to actually say whether we're achieving success or not. So we have to establish these baselines. And the target health assessment is all about really understanding, well, how do we actually track these things over time? What is the ecological integrity or the viability of those targets within our geographic scope? This always comes back to geography. How do we define a healthy target? So how do we define healthy coral reefs or healthy mangroves or healthy tropical dry forest and scrub? How do we actually measure that health consistently over time so we can track change? And ultimately, what is the health now? We need to set that baseline again so we can track whether that health is improving as we implement actions and strategies. Otherwise, there is no way to manage adaptively. We can't actually say whether all the investment of time and resources have actually resulted in a beneficial outcome for nature. You have to set a baseline to compare against, and this is what this step is all about. Ultimately, we want to rate the health of each of our targets as very good, good, fair, or poor. And we do that by capturing the current state of knowledge. We define key attributes, which is just a fancy way of saying an important characteristic that will allow us to understand the health of our target. We identify the indicators for each of our key attributes, the thing we're actually going to measure consistently over time. We define what very good, good, and fair and poor are in relation to that indicator. And then we say what the current status is. So if we go to our DCNA examples, I'm just going to show you one health assessment for each one of these targets to illustrate the process, but most of them actually have multiple. So for coral reefs, we read this table left to right. The target is coral reefs. The key attribute in this case is live hard coral coverage. And the thing we're going to measure, the indicator, is the percent of reef area with live hard coral coverage. We've been able to define what these indicator ratings are. There's definitions and justifications for these selections of what poor, fair, good, and very good mean. I'm not going to get into all that detail today. We don't have the time. But the point is, these actually come from best available information to inform how we define these indicator ratings. There's never a right answer. Important for everyone to distinguish. We are looking for what's reasonable based on whatever evidence is available to inform those decisions. At a high level, to help us think about how we define those indicator ratings, when we think of poor, we're thinking may result in extinction or extirpation without significant human intervention. Fair is outside some acceptable range of variation and probably requires some intervention. Good, within an acceptable range of variation, some intervention may be required for maintenance. And very good, the ecologically desirable status requires little intervention for maintenance. So very good, slam dunk. If it's in that category, let's keep it in that category. Good is good, but could probably be better. Fair, not good, and probably going to get worse if we don't take action. And poor, we're on life support. We're going to lose it. Something needs to be done. We go to mangroves. We're looking at the area of mangroves. Habitat loss still being the greatest risk to biodiversity worldwide. Taking an area-based indicator is often, a great way to measure the health of a particular ecosystem. Not always, but in many cases. And again, we are able to define what poor, fair, good, and very good are, doing a rough assessment of what we thought the historic amount of mangrove was in the Dutch Caribbean, and using that to reverse engineer our indicator ratings. Now, again, that's not the right way to do it. There is no right way to do it, but the team felt that this was a reasonable starting point to get an understanding of where the goalposts are when we think about, well, how much mangrove is there and where's the health right now? You can see based on the current value that we're in the fair category, and there has been a significant amount of mangrove loss in the Dutch Caribbean, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anybody. Seagrass, again, taking an area-based health assessment. How much seagrass is there? Currently in the fair category. Tropical dry forest and scrub. We took a different approach. We took more of a condition-based indicator here, so regenerative integrity, the proportion of tropical dry forest and scrub that's free of free-roaming grazers. And we just quartered those values between 0 and 100%. It was, a reasonable approach until better information becomes available. And you can see we're pretty firmly in the poor status currently. And then for tropical wet forest, we took an area-based measure. We also did a free roaming grazer measure for tropical wet forest as well. But the example here, just looking at total area and whether we're losing tropical wet forest over time, currently in the very good category. So there has been some loss, but based on more than 90% of the historic value still present. So that is how we assess the health of our targets. We're trying to choose key attributes, as few attributes as possible that will meaningfully allow us to capture the health of our targets. Someone actually is going to have to monitor this over time. This is not an academic exercise. We don't want a laundry list of all the things we wish we could measure. We want as few meaningful measures of health that we can actually track right now to understand whether we're improving the situation for our targets as we implement the plan. We want to select those indicators that are efficient and affordable to measure, of course, use existing data sources wherever possible. And I've said this before, really need to embrace the subjective nature of defining indicator ratings. We need to focus on what's reasonable, not what's right. We cannot let perfect be the enemy of good and hold us back from taking action. So really important to not leave blanks. A best guess by the team is still better than nothing. If we make a guess, we have made an assumption that we can now test as part of the adaptive management cycle. So to test assumptions, we have to make assumptions, and we need to get comfortable making some assumptions as a starting point so that we can actually build in the monitoring plan to improve on that information over time. Okay, so once we've established the health, we dive into the next step, was to identify and rate pressures. This will be very intuitive for most people. Pressures are human-induced activities or events that negatively impact our targets, right? Pollution, poaching, invasive species, and many, many other examples as well. The idea here is to first list all of the pressures that we know is having a negative impact on our targets within our geographic scope. again, within the area that we intend to actually influence this. Then, so that we can compare apples to apples and make sure we're prioritizing our precious time and resources in the right places, we do an assessment of the extent, the actual footprint of the pressure on the target, the severity, so the level of damage that's being caused by the pressure, and the irreversibility. If we could snap our fingers and that pressure disappeared, how likely would that target be able to recover on its own without human intervention? Those three assessments, extent, severity, and irreversibility, give us an overall pressure rating, which I'll illustrate here in a second, so that we're really comparing apples to apples. We all have personal biases of often thinking that a particular pressure is really, really bad because it's visual and we can see that there is something happening. But there's a lot of times pressures going on that aren't as visual, but are just as nefarious. And this allows us to really kind of take a step back and ensuring that we're putting our time and energy in the things that are most important, not the ones that we might think are the most important because our eyes deceive us. A great example of this, climate change is obviously a massive issue. I don't want to be, I don't want this to get confused as me saying otherwise. But oftentimes it's habitat loss is the more immediate issue that needs to be resolved. That if we don't address habitat loss, these climate change impacts that we're predicting won't matter because there won't be any habitat left in the first place. So we often think about climate change. It's in the news every single day. It's top of mind, climate change, climate change, climate change. But a lot of times there's these other pressures going on that we don't really think about. And they are actually having more negative impact in the immediate term. So this process gives us a bit of a better understanding of really what should we be focusing our time and attention on. Like I said, ultimately an apples to apples comparison so that each pressure is being rated as low, medium, high, or very high. And the results are used as a decision support tool so that the team can say, these are the pressures we're going to address in this iteration of the plan. And perhaps these are the ones we're not going to address. We don't have infinite time and resources. We need to be strategic, right? And so this helps us make those informed decisions. They do not dictate anything. The results, just because this result comes out doesn't force you into any particular scenario. The team needs to think about it and hopefully use the results as a guide as to where we take the plan next. So it starts with listing the pressures on the left-hand side. We've got some example targets as column headings and basically putting an X where we know there's a negative relationship between a pressure and a target. And then for each X, we're evaluating the extent, like I said, the proportion of the target that is likely to be affected, very high, high, medium, or low, and there's some very clear criteria for those categories. Severity, the level of damage that the pressure is going to cause to the target, again, very high, high, medium, or low. And irreversibility. If we had a genie and our wish was that this pressure disappeared, how likely could the target recover from the effects of the pressure if that pressure no longer existed? Very high, high, medium, or low. The results get pumped out. We have these matrices so that we're comparing the results consistently. And so the output looks something like this. And we can summarize that information across our targets and across our pressures and use this as decision support. So in this example, the team might say, well, we're definitely going to tackle bank hardening, even though it only came out as medium for whales or seabirds. Relative to the other pressures, it's having the highest impact across all of the biodiversity features that we care about. So bank hardening is going to be our first priority. Maybe they also have the capacity and the time to address the ones that came out as high. Maybe they don't, right? But this helps guide an informed discussion about where we move forward from here. This is the pressure assessment results from the DCNA Key Habitats Plan. Okay, so 13 pressures were identified across these targets. You can see 3 came out as very high across our targets: climate change, development, and invasive alien species and disease. As far as the targets that are being most impacted by pressures, you can see coral reefs came out as very high, and then mangroves, tropical dry forest came out as high. Seagrass and tropical wet forest came out as medium. So again, the team took these results. We used the results as a decision support tool on which of these situations, because every one of these colored boxes is a potential situation that we could unpack further and come up with solutions for. Which of these situations do we move forward with? And essentially the team said, we're going to select every one of these that is above low. And that is what we spent our time on when we moved into the next and final step of the assess phase, which is to conduct situation analyses. This is such a powerful tool to create a shared understanding of the very complex realities that we are working in and to identify potential solutions. We want to understand, okay, so we've identified a pressure, let's say it's development impacts. Well, what's contributing to that? What's allowing or encouraging development to have a negative impact on our targets? What are the social, economic, cultural, political, ecological, institutional factors that allow or encourage that pressure to negatively impact the targets? We can start mapping that complexity out. This is a bit of a silly example, but I think it illustrates how a situation analysis works. We read a situation analysis right to left. So in this case, the biodiversity that we're going to create a plan around is marine birds, and we've identified the pressure as recreational disturbance. When we start conducting this analysis, we're asking, well, what's driving this? What's allowing or encouraging this recreational disturbance to negatively affect marine birds within our geographic scope? We learned that in this case, there's children running on the beach, which is creating that recreational disturbance, and that's being driven by a lack of recreational alternatives. So a potential solution here is to build a playground. Now, if I said, I want you guys to come up with an idea on how to conserve marine birds, and your first suggestion was build a playground, and we don't have this logic in between, that's going to sound absurd. But the idea is when we get the right people in the room and we start mapping out the specific context within which we're working, we often get some of these perhaps outside the box ideas on how to address the specific situations within our geography. So this is a really, really critical tool. These situation analyses can become really complex, right? And that probably isn't a surprise to everybody. Here's an example of the first one that we created through the Key Habitats program. This is free roaming grazer impacts on our targets. You can see, I'm not going to walk through all of these in detail, but you can see there's a lot of factors that are allowing or encouraging free roaming grazers to impact our targets within the Dutch Caribbean. But there's also a lot of potential solutions as well, which are represented by these yellow hexagons. Okay, and this may not be exhaustive. This, like every part of a conservation standards process, is meant to be iterative. As new information, new insights come available, we're making sure to update this and make sure we're updating our current understanding of the situation. Once you get comfortable with the shape and color discipline of a situation analysis, you can start to unpack a really complex situation very quickly. So these visual diagrams are really, really important in ensuring that we have that shared understanding amongst the planning team. And also, like I said, to provide that opportunity to think about what the potential solutions are, including some outside the box ideas. Our second situation analysis was looking at the impacts of development. We then looked at wastewater release impacts, specifically on coral reefs, invasive alien species and disease, and climate change. This is a really complex one. The reality is, though, we do work in a lot of complexity. So unless we take the time to unpack that complexity, we're probably setting ourselves up for failure. So these tools are really, really important to ensure that we're actually choosing the right actions and strategies to have the effect that we want. Some considerations when you're doing this with a team. Ultimately, we're trying to locate those opportunities for action. All models are wrong. Some are useful. We're trying to create a useful model of the current reality. You could spend a lifetime trying to fine tune everything, right? There's diminishing returns. We just want to get, as best we can, an understanding of where we're currently at so that we can locate those opportunities for action. Content is more important than format. We use online software, whiteboard software, but you could be drawing figures in the sand with sticks and still get the same outcome, or using sticky notes on the wall. Pre-COVID, that's how we all did this type of work. A wide range of expertise on the team is likely to provide better understanding of an overall situation, and you might want to go through multiple iterations of a situation analysis as you bring more people on and you get different perspectives. We try to base links on evidence and really avoid speculation. We're not trying to solve problems that don't exist. If there's something we're like, well, we're not really sure, this could be a problem, put that in a document called the parking lot, where we can identify knowledge gaps to figure out. We don't want to spend too much planning time coming up with solutions that might not, to problems that might not exist. So avoid speculation. And in general, These are meant to be communication tools. It takes some discipline to try and make sure that, lines aren't crossing in a million different ways and you get this spaghetti mess that no one can understand, right? It is really important to keep them clean and organized. So something to keep in mind if you ever end up working with teams developing situation analyses. That wraps up the assess phase. So once we've completed the assess phase, the team now has a shared understanding of why we're creating the plan, who needs to be involved, the specific geography within which we intend to have a beneficial impact, the specific biodiversity that we intend to benefit, as well as the pressures having a negative impact on them, and a suite of potential actions that we've identified that may help improve the situation. I guess I should have said earlier on, when we're developing those situation analyses and people are putting ideas up, there's no expectation we're going to implement every one of those yellow hexagons. This is a brainstorming exercise. We want to get all the ideas on the board. There's no wrong answers. We're going to evaluate those at the next step in the process. And that brings us into the plan phase. We're going to take a break in about, let's say, 20 minutes. I'll get everyone an opportunity to take a little bio break. I'll try and get through as much of this as I can. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end in case people have questions or you'd like to maybe even describe some of your own projects and programs, if you've applied to conservation standards or how you see this maybe fitting within your own work. So I'll try to make sure that I have enough time towards the end for some discussion. So I'll try and push through as much as I can before our break. When we talk about the plan phase, we're thinking about the future that we want to create. So assess is all about establishing the current reality. Now we want to say, well, what is the change we're trying to create? That starts with a vision. And you've probably all been part of a visioning exercise at some point. A vision is an aspirational description of the desired state or the ultimate condition that your project or program is working to achieve. We want to keep a vision relatively general. It should be stated in a broad way. A vision is not a goal. You should never be able to actually tick a box and say the vision has been achieved. Okay, it's a broad statement of a future that encompasses the entire project scope and activities. And it should be visionary, right? We want to be bold and outline the desired change that we want to create. It should also be simple and succinct. Think of it as an elevator pitch. If someone comes to you and says, well, what's this planning initiative all about? You can rhyme off a couple sentences and they're going to get a very good idea of ultimately what you're working to achieve. Best practices is 3 sentences or less. If you can't define your vision in less than 3 sentences, you probably don't have a shared understanding amongst the team of what it is you're ultimately trying to achieve. We've got a very succinct vision statement that the DCNA team crafted for the Key Habitats program. We envision a Dutch Caribbean where nature is safeguarded. Through collaboration and long-term sustainable financing, the loss of key habitats is halted or reversed, ecosystems are restored and vibrant, and communities live in harmony with nature. This is a very strong vision statement. You'll never be able to say, yep, this has been achieved. Right? This is something that you can be constantly working towards. There will always be room for improvement, but it sets that North Star so that everybody within the organization, all of the partners, the funders, the political support know that we're rowing in the same direction. Once you decide what the vision is going to, I have another slide here. Like I said, vision is meant to be a unifying force. There's no right answer, right? There's a million potential futures, an infinite number of potential futures we may want to create. So it's not about getting the right answer. It's about making sure everybody feels comfortable and it really resonates with people. A vision statement should get people excited. And like I just said, a vision is not a goal. You should not be able to objectively state that a vision has been achieved. So once you establish the vision, the next step is to get really specific on how we're defining success. This is arguably one of the most important steps of the process and one that unfortunately gets overlooked oftentimes, defining the goals. Now, again, at the beginning, I said the word goal can mean a lot of different things in different contexts. We mean something very specific within this framework. It is a formal, SMART statement of the desired future health of our targets. So when we talk about SMART, many of you may be familiar with this acronym. It's specific. So the goal should be worded in a way that specifies the target you're trying to benefit, as well as the geographic scope, so that there's no subjective interpretation as to what the goal is intended to achieve. It shouldn't be open to interpretation how you define success, and we want to make sure that it's written specifically to do that. Measurable, so definable in relation to some standard scale of measurement. That could be quantitative. It could also be qualitative. Achievable, so it can be accomplished within the project constraints. This is a little bit more subjective, but it's important that the team has a conversation about this. It's great. It's good to be bold. It's okay to have stretch goals, but it has to be within the realm of what's actually possible. Results oriented, so it should reflect the change necessary to actually improve the situation as best we can. And it should be time bound. So we put a deadline on this, framed within a very specific period of time, by 2028 or by 2035, so everyone knows by which time we want to achieve the goal. If we hit these 5 criteria, there is no way to misinterpret how you've defined success for your project or program, and that is ultimately what we're trying to achieve with this step. So the process involves choosing a target to get started, then going to those key attributes through the health assessment where we've defined what the current health is, and we want to ensure that we're representing that indicator. So there's a one-to-one relationship between the current health of our targets and what we want that health to be in the future. So we write a draft description, we apply the 5 SMART criteria, and we can modify as necessary. So if we go to our DCNA example and our first target, coral reefs, remember we were going to measure percent of reef area with live hard coral coverage. We're still updating this value. We're having a hard time getting our hands on some data, but we think with the data that we have, we're roughly at 9%, which puts us in the poor category. This will be refined over time. But let's assume that that's where we're at right now. A goal that meets the 5 SMART criteria could look like this. By 2050, the percentage of reef area with live hard coral coverage will not fall below the current amount of approximately 9% across the Dutch Caribbean. Okay, it's specific. It actually names the target, so it's reef. It names the geography, the Dutch Caribbean. It's measurable, so we actually have a number. It's not going to fall below, in this case, approximately 9%. We'll assume that this is achievable. Now, this was a big conversation about what's actually achievable. DCNA, and I have to take my hat off to them, they wanted to be really ambitious. We don't know how we're going to do this yet, but this is the line in the sand. They said in their vision that they want to see the health of biodiversity in the Dutch Caribbean improve, and so they set a goal that's going to achieve that. We don't know how yet, but there's some ideas about how we might get that started. I will say too, I'm just showing you in a single goal example for each target. There is actual multiple goals for every target. There's another goal by 2100 to actually increase the area of hard coral coverage. And again, we don't know how we're going to do that yet, but we're setting our line in the sand and saying, this is our ambition. This is ultimately what we want to achieve. And by stating that ambition, the theory is it's going to open up opportunities for innovation, new technology, new funding streams to figure out how we can actually do this and move the needle in a positive direction. Results oriented in that it felt like, well, even just holding the line at this point, because we are seeing a decline in hard coral coverage almost right across the board in the Caribbean. This is still results oriented if we could hold the line by 2050, and time bound, so by 2050. So it meets all 5 of the SMART criteria. You could copy and paste this from the plan into some external document, and someone that has not even been part of these conversations can read this goal, and they'll still know exactly what it is you're trying to achieve. There's no subjective interpretation here. If we go to our next one, mangroves. Currently at 380 hectares, which put us in the fair category according to our indicator ratings. A SMART goal by 2050, the total area of mangroves will increase from 380 hectares to 407 hectares or greater across the Dutch Caribbean. Okay, once again, it meets all the 5 SMART criteria. It's specific, it's measurable. In this case, the team has agreed we want to get from the fair category into the good category. Okay, so again, that health assessment, it's not perfect. There's not going to be a perfect objective definitions to these indicator ratings, but it helps us define where the goalposts are. And so in this case, we want to move a category into what we assume is a better state of health. So from 380 to 407 hectares, it is results oriented. We're actually seeing an improvement here. Well, obviously the team thinks that this is achievable, and there's a lot of great work already going on in the Dutch Caribbean when it comes to mangrove conservation and restoration. So that really helped inform that conversation about what's achievable. And it's time bound, also by 2050. Seagrass, again, looking at an area-based measure of health. Similarly, trying to get from the fair category to the good category by 2050. Tropical dry forest and scrub, proportion of tropical dry forest and scrub free of free roaming grazers. Again, we're pretty firmly in the poor category currently. The goal here by 2050, the proportion of tropical dry forest and scrub free of free roaming grazers will increase from 4.48% to 26% or greater. So again, trying to jump an entire category. By the way, you don't always have to do that, right? It's not that a goal has to reflect a jump in a category. Sometimes maybe the best you can do, like the coral example, is to hold the line. Sometimes you might have to face the music in a really unfortunate and sensitive situation where you have to set palliative goals. That the best we can do is hopefully slow a decline. We can't actually improve the situation. Sometimes with specific species that are critically endangered, that's maybe the best we can do. And so that's still results oriented. I hope none of you ever have to deal with that particular situation, but it is a reality in conservation. And sometimes we do have to have those conversations. Our last example, tropical wet forest. And again, we looked at an area-based indicator. In this case, we want to hold what we have. It's in the very good status. We want to keep it in the very good status. And so it's great to set a goal that just says that this is where we're at and we don't want it to get any worse. So a no net loss of tropical wet forest. So we want to maintain that at 973 hectares. So I hope this illustrates the importance of setting a baseline to understand where we're at now, even if that information is not perfect, so that we can define where we want to get in the future. Once you start implementing, you're going to get better information and you can come back and adapt this and iterate on this. Continuous learning, continuous improvement. The issue we have right now, oftentimes in these planning initiatives, if we don't have some peer-reviewed evidence to draw from, everyone's too scared to put a number in the box. We got to get past this. Okay, we're in a biodiversity crisis. We do not have time as a luxury. We have to get started. Best available information often means a best guess by the team. And the reality is, I mean, I've worked with more than 400 organizations around the world now working to develop plans like this. Oftentimes, we're trying to create a plan for a species or an ecosystem that has been studied out the wazoo, decades of science, and not one shred of that information is useful to inform an action plan. Once again, this comes back to the premise of this presentation, this idea of actually generating information that's fit for purpose, making sure that the planning exercise is telling us what information we need to improve on, which then tells us what are the research questions we should be addressing, or the practitioner experience that we should be trying to get, or the local and indigenous knowledge that we should be trying to capture, right? Use the planning process as the tool to define what questions to answer. And that way you will ensure that the data, the information is fit for purpose to inform action and continuous improvement. So this is, as you can probably tell, the keystone to adaptive management, ensuring we've set this baseline, we know where we're at now, and use that to define where we want to get in the future. So considerations when developing goals. Setting SMART goals is critical to ensure the team has a shared understanding of how success is defined. There should never, under any circumstances, whether it's the conservation standards or any planning framework, be a definition of success that's open to interpretation. Increase the area of tropical wet forest. That's useless. So if we increase it by 2 square meters, is that success? No, probably not. Is it 1 million hectares? Well, in a particular island, that might not be realistic. If anybody can just take that and just subjectively decide what success means for them, you're not going to have groups of people turning into teams and rowing in the same direction. We need to be really specific about how we're defining success. So avoid these really nebulous, open-ended success statements and calling those goals. That's really not helping us take action and inform action planning. A strategy to restore 2 square meters of tropical wet forest is going to be fundamentally different from a strategy that's looking to restore 1,000 hectares of tropical wet forest, right? So your level of ambition will inform what actions and strategies you choose to implement. So don't leave it up to subjective interpretation. Be very, very clear on how success is defined. That's what being strategic is. Defining success so we can evaluate what we're going to do is going to get us there. Every target should have a minimum of one goal, but realistically, if you've created multiple key attributes and indicators to understand the health of a target, and oftentimes you will, there won't be one thing to measure. There might be 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe more. Every one of those should have a goal associated with it. We're not creating a monitoring plan for the sake of collecting data. This is to inform action. So if we say we need to understand this component of a target's health, there should be a goal associated with that on how we're going to try and improve that health over time. You can have several time sequential goals. So the coral reef example, like I said, by 2050, we're trying to hold the line at the current amount, but by 2100, we actually want to increase that area of hard coral coverage. And lastly, goals define the time frame of your plan as a whole. If you had 3 goals, one is by 2030, one's by 2050, and one by 2100, your strategic plan in its entirety is between 2025 and 2100 because you are going to be implementing and monitoring out to the farthest goal. So that sets the lifespan of your plan. We'll go into strategies, then we'll take a break. There'll be plenty of time, by the way, for questions at the end. Because I can't really see folks, I decided not to have questions as we go through. It's a little bit of a different format that I'm used to, but we'll make sure after the presentation that we have lots of time for questions and comments. I will do strategies next, then we'll take a little break. So when we think about strategies, we're talking about a group of actions with a common focus that work together to reduce the pressures and improve the health of our targets. The process involves going through all of those yellow hexagons. We've brainstormed these already through the previous process when we've conducted those situation analyses. So we've got this list of potential actions. We go through those and we make sure we update the wording to ensure that we all have a shared understanding of what their intent is. And then we evaluate the effectiveness of each one. And effectiveness is a product of its feasibility and its impact. And we'll get into those definitions in a second. And similar to that pressure analysis that I showed you, the results here are used as a decision support tool to choose which of those actions and strategies are we going to implement, and perhaps which ones are we not going to implement, because either they're not feasible or they're not impactful. Again, there's no expectation we're going to implement every single idea. This gives us the opportunity to have informed discussion about what's really going to move the needle to achieve our goals that we just set. So we can organize those final list of actions that we've chosen for implementation into those overarching strategies. So this is an example, not the DCNA example. This is just for illustrative purposes. We've got a situation analysis where there's 5 targets on the right-hand side, a suite of pressures. They've mapped out the contributing factors that are allowing or encouraging those pressures to have a negative impact. And they came up with 4 different ideas for potential actions. Now they're at the stage where they want to evaluate these. And so for each one of those yellow hexagons, they said, within our geographic scope, to what extent can we realistically implement this action, considering financial, technical, ethical constraints? We want to rate that as very high, high, medium, or low. And again, we've got a clear definition for each one of those. And even more important, to what extent is that potential action likely to contribute to achieving one or more goals? This is so important. The question is not, do you like the action? It is not, do you believe the action will have a beneficial outcome? It is, will this action contribute to achieving the goals that we just set? Being strategic is about a one-to-one relationship between how success is defined and the choices we make on what we're going to do to achieve it. So it's really, really important to be disciplined. And I will be honest with you, DCNA has done a great job of being disciplined, but most organizations or teams, when we get to this step, have a really hard time, right? Some of them have been doing certain things for a really long time, and they just want to keep doing those things, even though there's clearly no connection between what they're doing and the goals that they've just set. So sometimes this is a little bit of a challenge for certain organizations. In our case, though, this was something we got through relatively quickly with DCNA. There really was a clear one-to-one relationship in how we chose what actions and strategies we should move forward with to achieve those goals. It was a very pragmatic step in the process. So that's feasibility and impact. They give us an overall effectiveness rating. And again, the results don't dictate anything. They're just used as decision support on how we move forward to choose which actions to implement. So every action gets rated as either very effective, effective, needs more information, or not effective. And so we go back to our illustrative example. The team got the full suite of ratings across their 4 actions, and they use that to decide to implement 2 of these and not implement 2 others. I'm not going to run through every action and strategy from the Key Habitats program example, but just to illustrate, this is what the results look like from our first situation analyses, a suite of actions, all working to reduce free roaming grazer impacts. We evaluated feasibility and impact. You can see there was a whole span of outcomes from that. In this case, for one reason or another, they all came out as needs more information. Either we're not really sure about where the money would come from to be able to actually implement this at scale across the Dutch Caribbean, or we would have to probably do some pilot testing to see whether this would be impactful towards achieving our goals before we implemented it at scale. So in all cases, the effectiveness came out as needs more info, but also in all cases, the team agreed we are going to move forward with these for implementation. This is a really important part of improving the health of biodiversity in the Dutch Caribbean, is trying to reduce the impacts of free roaming grazers, which again, I'm sure is of no surprise to anybody here. We looked at reducing development impacts. In one of these examples, it was decided not to pursue this, and there's specific reasons why, and that justification has been recorded. Again, I'm not getting into that detail in our session today, but there are strategic decisions that have to be made, of course. We looked at wastewater release impacts. We talked a lot about this one and realized that in many cases, the feasibility here would be very challenging. And it's unclear whether, even if we did do some stuff within the Dutch Caribbean, whether we could actually achieve the goals anyway because of external factors that are affecting water quality. So some difficult decisions sometimes need to be made, difficult conversations and discussions. But ultimately, this is what this tool is meant to do, is to help ensure that we're having those discussions and making those strategic decisions. We also looked at invasive alien species and disease and our climate change impacts. So some considerations when you're doing this step with the team. You want to make sure that each of the actions is worded in such a way that it's clear what the action is intended to achieve. So it should begin with a verb, so we know what we're doing. For example, when you're brainstorming with a situation analysis, and let's say we're trying to conserve tropical dry forest, and someone says, oh, I've got an idea. What about carbon markets? And we put carbon markets up on the board. Well, at this stage, carbon markets needs to be thought through a little bit more. Are we saying we're going to create a carbon market? Are we trying to tap into an existing market? What is that market? Are we trying to scale up an existing market? Right? There could be a million different things as to what you're actually trying to do in related to carbon markets. So being really specific with the verb at the beginning, but also what the intended result is. What is the outcome that we're trying to achieve? That ensures that everybody's going through this effectiveness rating exercise with a shared understanding of exactly what the intent is of each of the actions. Want to be careful about disregarding potentially impactful actions because of perceptions of financial feasibility. If I can share another take-home message here, as conservationists, now this is not true across the board, but generally speaking, we have this scarcity mindset. And if we don't have the money right now, then it's not feasible. Well, if you don't put it in your plan, you're not going to get the money to implement it, right? So we got to get past the scarcity mindset to start actually building scaled actions and strategies and get the level of funding we need to make a meaningful impact. So I really encourage teams not to get caught up on what your current financial situation is. Put it in the plan, scope it out so people can see how their contribution is going to help you achieve success. And you'll be amazed at the funding that comes out of the woodwork to help you do that. DCNA has been really clear about this. We're talking about orders of magnitude more funding that we want to be able to implement this program out to 2100. So it was really refreshing to be able to have this conversation without that scarcity mindset. Let's aim big and try to achieve meaningful change across the Dutch Caribbean at scale. Best practice, organize actions and strategies based on the specific pressures that they're designed to address. That was how you just saw those examples that I showed you from DCNA. Hypothetically, you could have one massive diagram with all of that stuff together, but then, the usefulness as a communication tool starts to degrade. So I encourage teams to kind of break them out into meaningful chunks. Totally up to you. And this is just a good FYI. Good strategic planning is not just being clear about what you're going to do, it's also being crystal clear what you're not going to do and being able to say no. This funding opportunity came to us, but we're going to say no because it's not going to push us in the direction that we've said we want to get to. Being able to say no is the single most powerful thing you can do as an organization, being really clear how you've defined success and the things you're going to say yes to and no to ensure that you're moving towards that success. Let's take a pause. We'll go with a full 15 minutes. Again, I can't see you folks. You might all be asleep by now. I hope so far everybody's still with me and you find this interesting. When we come back, we'll dive into theories of change and we'll have lots of time for some questions and discussion at the end. I've got 3 more steps, and then I think maybe if we can hold questions till then, just to get through this part of the presentation, and then we can just open it up. I actually have some other slides. We can see what the group would like to do about how we could actually tie this into nature-based solutions specifically, but I'll put a pause on that. These next few slides I'm going to get through relatively quickly, and then I think we'll open it up for questions.
All right, fantastic. Then it's over to you.
Can everyone see my screen?
I can see you.
Perfect. Okay, so the next step, where we came from before the break, thinking about how we're going to define success, prioritizing those actions and strategies that are going to get us to that definition of success as efficiently and effectively as possible. The next stage is to start looking at the assumptions on how we think those actions and strategies will actually result in the success that we want to achieve. And that's where we move into theories of change and objectives. Many of you are probably familiar with the idea of a theory of change within conservation standards language. Sometimes they use the words results chains, whatever, same thing. I call them theories of change. And these are designed to explicitly identify and connect the assumptions on how we think our actions and strategies will achieve those desired outcomes. We develop theories of change by connecting our assumptions using conditional statements. It's called if-then statements. If we implement this action, then we assume this outcome. If we get that outcome, then we assume this second outcome, et cetera, all the way down to the assumption that our targets, our coral reefs, our mangroves, whatever they happen to be, will actually improve towards achieving the goals that we set. So if we, to take a step back, for example, let's pretend we're a team and we are developing a conservation plan for sharks within the Caribbean. Okay, so this is a situation analysis. We've identified sharks as our conservation target. We've identified harvesting for shark fins as a pressure that's having a negative impact on sharks. And when we were conducting our situation analyses and asking, well, what's driving the harvesting for shark fins? We learned that there's a high price for shark fins. That's being driven by demand for shark fin soup. That's being driven by traditions and consumer preferences. And so somebody put the idea forward of, well, maybe a media campaign could be implemented to try and change those traditions and consumer preferences. We'll assume that that potential action went through feasibility and an impact rating. It came out as effective, and the team said, you know what, we're going to implement this one. Now we actually have to map out how we think that media campaign is going to result in a beneficial impact. And so we've created a theory of change that's going to tell the story, provide the narrative on how the media campaign is expected to benefit sharks. And again, we use if-then logical statements to make a connection between those assumptions. So for example, if we implement the media campaign, assumption number one is that consumers will understand the impacts of buying shark fin soup. That assumption has to come true for that media campaign to be effective. If consumers understand the impacts of buying shark fin soup, then the demand for shark fin soup will go down. The second assumption that has to come true for this media campaign to be effective. If demand for shark fin soup goes down, then we assume the market will respond and the price of shark fins will go down. Assumption number three, that has to come true. And if the market responds and the price goes down, then we assume shark fin harvesting will decline. Assumption number four, that has to come true. If shark fin harvesting declines, then we assume shark populations will increase. Assumption number five. Every action that has ever been implemented has a bunch of assumptions embedded in it that have to come true for it to actually result in some sort of beneficial impact for the biodiversity that we care about. Whether it's an education campaign, whether it's some sort of research project, whatever it happens to be, there's always assumptions that have to come true if we want these things to actually result in a benefit for nature. It's really important that we start mapping those assumptions out and building a shared understanding within our organizations and our conservation teams on what those assumptions are. Because if we don't map them out, we can't actually test whether they're coming true or not. And if you can't test whether your assumptions are coming true, you have no idea whether you're actually effective. And again, as you all know, these things cost time and money. We need to start building a better understanding of what's working and what's not working, so we don't spend a bunch of time and effort and career on doing things that actually may not be having any effect whatsoever. So this, again, a critical step in the concept of adaptive conservation or adaptive management. We have to map our assumptions so we have a mechanism to test those assumptions. So when we're developing theories of change, again, we're trying to tell a story. How this particular action or strategy is going to result in a beneficial outcome for whatever biodiversity we're developing the plan for. Every action that's been selected for implementation should be included in a theory of change. There's really no exception. There's never been an action ever implemented that doesn't have some assumptions embedded in it that have to come true. So being really clear about that for everything you're going to invest time and money into implementing is really a best practice. And it also is oftentimes a good reality check to see whether the actions and strategies will actually contribute to achieving the goals that we set. And when we did this through DCNA, there were a couple stopping points where we said, actually, we said we were going to implement this, but now that we actually map this out, I'm not sure this makes sense anymore. Okay, so it ensures it's kind of like a double check that we are actually making strategic informed decisions about what's actually going to move the needle to achieve the goals that we've set, our measures of success. We're really trying to capture those key assumptions and steer clear of what we call miracles. Okay, these major jumps in logic. If we implement this education campaign, then everybody will love nature and it will be saved. No, it doesn't work that way. There are a bunch of assumptions in the middle there that have to come true. And we risk, if we don't map those out and test those assumptions, we risk actually spending a lot of precious time and resources implementing things that may not be working. Or we could actually be achieving much more if we looked at it from a different perspective and maybe did things a little bit differently. It's actually not just about it working, not working, as if it's this binary thing. It's oftentimes about, oh, wow, it's working, but it could be working a lot better if we did this, right? It gives us this opportunity to adapt as we respond to the information being generated. Once those theories of change are developed, then we can actually choose the assumptions that we're going to test. to see whether those theories of change are actually true or not. And that's where we get to objectives. An objective is a formal, smart statement of the desired outcome of a strategy. Similar to goals, and we'll get into again to the difference between goals and objectives. Sometimes it's a little bit confusing if you're new to this. Objectives should be smart, so they should be specific. They should be linked to a specific assumption in your theory of change and worded in a way that we all have a clear understanding of what the intent is. Should be measurable, should be achievable, should be results oriented, so actually reflect at minimum what we would expect as far as success. If we're going to invest time and money in a media campaign, as an example, what's the minimum level of investment or return on investment we would expect? So thinking of it in that regard. And then time bound, framed within a specific period of time. So if we go back to our shark example, again, we said, well, this media campaign has the potential to change the situation and improve the health of our sharks. There's a bunch of assumptions that have to come true. Which of these are we going to test? Well, assumption number 2 was that the demand for shark fin soup will go down. You can take this assumption and you can flip it into a testable objective. Within 2 years of the media campaign, demand for shark fin soup will decrease by 25%. That is a statement that will actually be true or not within a specific period of time. You can develop a monitoring plan around this and actually see whether this came true. Now, whether the right number is 25% or 50% or 75%, that's for the team to decide. Again, what's the minimum level of success we would expect if we're going to invest the time and money into implementing a media campaign, right? We should be clear about how success is being defined. But irregardless of what that value is, or whether it's 2 years or 5 years, putting in a SMART objective allows us to design a fit for purpose monitoring plan to determine whether the actions and strategies we invest in implementing are actually effective or not. We can actually test these assumptions. Similarly, assumption number 4 was that we're actually going to reduce the pressure itself. So shark fin harvesting will decline. You can take that assumption, you can flip that into something that's testable. By 2025, shark fin harvesting has declined by 50% or more. You can design a monitoring plan around this and actually see whether your media campaign has resulted in a decline of shark fin harvesting. Again, whether 50% is the right number, maybe you would expect something higher if you're going to put in the investment for a media campaign, right? That's for the team to decide. But ultimately, there is a clear measure of success that we're going to evaluate against. This is super crucial. Right? Without mapping the assumptions, there's no way to test the assumptions, and therefore there is no way to determine whether what we're doing is achieving success or not. So this is what being evidence-based is all about. Having clearly defined measures of success that are not open to subjective interpretation, a clear roadmap on how we think our actions and strategies will achieve that success, a mechanism to test whether the assumptions are true or not, so that if they turn out not to be true, we can have an informed discussion about how we're going to adapt the plan. Maybe in this example, we implement a media campaign and shark fin harvesting only declined by 30%. Okay, well, we saw some success, but not the level of success we were hoping. This gives us an opportunity to come back and say, well, maybe we need to tailor our target audience a little bit better. Or maybe the messaging needs to be changed a little bit. Let's test something different. Or maybe a media campaign was the wrong choice to hit a 50% decline in shark fin harvesting. And maybe we go back to the drawing board and try and figure something else out. At least you have the ability to make an informed discussion or to have an informed discussion about what changes should be made to try and hit that level of success that you've defined. Without this, we can't even have that discussion. It's just everybody's hope and believe that we're doing the best we can, and whatever it is we do, we hope it helps sharks. We need to start moving away from that and trying to build out an evidence base to make sure that we're investing our precious time and resources in the things that are working. So here's an example. I'm not going to go through all of the theories of change and objectives from the DCNA project. There's a lot of material there, but this is just one example from our first strategy to reduce free roaming grazer impacts. All of those actions around reducing free roaming grazer impacts are contributing to that outcome, that free roaming grazer impacts are reduced. And there's a bunch of assumptions that have to come true for these actions to result in a beneficial outcome for our biodiversity targets. So we've mapped those out, and we've gone through a process of choosing which of these assumptions should we test. So for example, we have a total area of degraded forest will decrease if we scale up reforestation in areas degraded by grazers. We can test whether that total area degraded by of degraded forest decreases over time. We have a theory that more grazing restrictions and exclusion measures will be implemented. We've got some objectives there, 1.2 to 1.5. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not. We have an assumption that governments will invest in controlling grazers. We can test whether that's true or not. We have an assumption that the number of landowners and managers working to improve grazer husbandry practices will increase. We can actually take that assumption and flip that into a testable hypothesis. That brings us to the objectives. So again, just as an example, we have a minimum of 30 hectares reforested in areas degraded by grazers by 2030. We have a series of objectives around increasing the area with designations. So fencing installations to keep grazers out of ecologically valued areas, fencing installations to allow farmers to keep free roaming grazers contained, et cetera, et cetera. We've got an objective here around the amount of funding that we would like to see get invested in grazer control measures by island governments by 2050. And by 2035, a minimum of 50 landowners and managers are applying improved grazer husbandry practices. Now, again, there's no right answer. If we take that example, 1.7, should it be 50 landowners or 70 landowners or 150 landowners? Once you start implementing this and collecting the information, you're going to get a better understanding of the reality. But at least this gives us something to work towards, acknowledging that there's no right answer, right? Once we start implementing this, maybe we realize, ooh, this is a lot harder than we thought. Maybe we got to bring the bar down to something more realistic. Maybe it's 30. Or we hit 50 by 2030. Let's increase this. By 2035, maybe we can triple the amount. This is not meant to be set in stone. This is all meant to be updated over time as new information and insights become available as you start implementing, right? So we get this process again. You've heard me say this a million times: continuous learning, continuous improvement, ensuring that this is not static. It is not set in stone. So some considerations when we're developing objectives. The purpose of designing objectives is to test whether our assumptions are true. Every action and strategy ever implemented by any organization in the world had a bunch of assumptions in it, and it's whether they were actually able to articulate those assumptions and test them that determines whether they're an evidence-based organization or not. Oops. Right, so ultimately we're trying to do this so we can adapt what we're doing and not just hope and believe that all the work that we're doing is resulting in something beneficial, that we're actually able to demonstrate that that's the case. And that brings us into the last two steps where we're basically pulling all this information together. So the monitoring plan, the periodic collection and evaluation of data relative to the goals and the objectives. So we're not collecting data for the sake of data collection. We're trying to evaluate whether our actions and strategies have been effective at improving the health of our targets. So this is called status monitoring. Is the state of nature actually changing over time as a result of all the actions and strategies that we implement? So are we achieving the goals that we set, which is a statement on the improvement in the health of our targets? And are the individual actions and strategies themselves having their intended impact? Effectiveness monitoring. So are those objectives being met? We might have a goal to improve the health of mangroves, and there might be 10 different actions and strategies all contributing to improving the health of mangroves. We have to be evaluating whether each one of those individually is effective or not. So if 3 of those turn out to be really effective, but the other 7 aren't, stop investing time and money into the 7 that aren't and double down on the 3 that are, right? It gives us that opportunity to make these informed decisions. So the monitoring plan is really, really key. Without it, again, you can't actually determine whether success is being achieved. So we're looking at status monitoring and effectiveness monitoring. And the process involves just taking all those goals and objectives that we've set, figuring out what it is specifically we're going to measure consistently over time. What are the methods that we're going to implement to ensure that we do have that consistent measurement over time? Defining who's going to conduct the assessment. This is so critical. If there's no accountability, this just becomes a wish list. Make sure we've got names beside monitoring tasks so that there's some accountability and this actually gets implemented. And then how often we actually need to do the measurements, right? For some of these things, maybe we need to measure every year, maybe every 5 years. It depends on how far out your plan goes, how sensitive the situation is. In some cases, you might need even to measure more frequently than a year. Maybe it's even every month if you're dealing with a really critically endangered population of a species or an ecosystem on the verge of collapse. Right. So just being kind of sensitive to the needs of the specific thing you're measuring to figure out what that time frame should be. These are the bare minimum requirements of an effective monitoring plan. Now, there's a whole world of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And of course, this can be built out to be much more complex in many cases, but it doesn't have to be complex. I like to tell people we don't need the gold standard all the time. Oftentimes, the aluminum standard will do just fine for us to understand whether we're moving the needle in a positive direction. So focus on good and don't let perfect be the enemy of good. These 5 bare minimum requirements will give you a strong monitoring plan, but of course, you can always build on that and include more information. And this is just an example. Some of the goals, some of the objectives from the DCNA plan, the specific indicators we're going to measure, a summary of the methods. Oftentimes, we're going to refer back to a more detailed document that really lays out what that methodology looks like so that it's replicable. Of course, the time frame, and then who's ultimately responsible for ensuring that that monitoring data is being collected. And then we move into the operational plan. And again, an operational plan can be really complex. You can have a lot of detailed information in there, but at minimum, what we need for an effective operational plan is clearly defining who is responsible for implementing each of the actions we've said needs to be implemented. Again, without a name beside these things, we don't have a plan, we have a wish list. So really important to understand within our own organization, if we're in charge of creating the plan, or perhaps it's with partners, who's ultimately going to take the reins in coordinating the implementation of that particular action and strategy. Thinking about when we're going to implement. There's no expectation that we're going to implement everything all at the same time. Sometimes we might have specific actions that are higher priority, so they need to be implemented now versus others that maybe we can look at in a couple of years. Perhaps some actions can only be implemented in a time sequential sequence, right? So thinking about timing and being clear on the start and end points, oftentimes is expressed in years. It doesn't have to be, but that can be a helpful starting point to be really clear on, okay, these are the actions we're going to start with right now versus the ones that we'll come back to at some point in the future. They're all important. We're going to implement them. It's just a matter of when. And then budget. Even a ballpark estimate of what we think the cost will be to implement each one of those actions and strategies. Order of magnitude is okay as a starting point. We're not going to get really precise. Again, as we start implementing, we'll get better understanding of costs and we can update all this stuff. But at least a first pass to understand order of magnitude. Is this action going to be $1,000, $10,000, $1 million? Once you get that into an Excel spreadsheet or some other tool, you can sum all the costs across all the actions and strategies and say, to achieve success for the biodiversity that this plan intends to benefit, it's going to cost this much. And that can be an incredibly powerful tool to gain support from funders, from decision makers. You have a transparent plan on how you're going to get from point A to point B, and this is the cost that's going to get us there. Do you want to be a part of this journey? People can actually see where their contribution is going to make a difference. So really, really important to have that project budget. Get as specific as you can, recognizing you're not going to have the right number. At this stage, you can always improve on that over time. So this is an example. Again, I just cherry picked a few items to illustrate from the DCNA Key Habitats Plan. We've got a variety of strategies. Who's going to be the implementation lead? For some of these, DCNA is going to be the lead. For some, it's recognized that this will be partner-led. The time frame for implementation and the desired budget. These numbers, by the way, are all made up for the sake of the example. But the idea is to put a number beside these things on how we think they're going to, how much we think they're going to cost. And then you can sum and say, this strategy will cost X, all the strategies combined will cost Y. And this is what it will cost ultimately to achieve the goals that we set. And that basically wraps up the plan phase. So once you've completed the assess phase and the plan phase, you now have a completed plan ready to go. Now, again, it's not meant to be static. It's meant to be a living document. It's meant to be dynamic. You're always updating it, but you have a start to finish plan that you can get started on. The next step is to move into implementation. Arguably the most important thing, right? To actually get some work done. We don't plan for the sake of planning. We actually want to get boots on the ground in the water, whatever it happens to be. But oftentimes there does need to be another level of planning to even get started. So for each individual action, right, we need to understand who's going to do what. There's some implementation planning that needs to take place. What are the specific tasks? There's a variety of ways you can map that out. We have our own process within Global Conservation Solutions that we support teams in doing implementation planning. Then we get into refining those budgets as we get started, as we implement those strategies and actions. We're going to learn things as we go. Unexpected stuff is going to happen. The only certainty we have in life is that the future is uncertain, right? But this gives us an opportunity to pivot as new information becomes available. The next step, analyze and adapt. This is a really, really important one. And again, it's one that often gets overlooked. That monitoring data that's being collected actually has to be analyzed. It takes time and effort to take a look at that data, analyze the data, collate the data, turn that into knowledge and insights that you then feed back into the plan to make strategic decisions on any changes that might need to be made. If this isn't part of somebody's work plan, it will fall through the cracks and your whole process is going to fall apart. So somebody actually has to take the reins and ensure that in their calendar, they have time set aside to collect that monitoring data and evaluate it and determine what knowledge is being generated so that it can inform some sort of adaptation of the plan if things aren't turning out as we predicted. The fifth stage is share. And this is about documenting lessons learned, what's worked, but also what hasn't worked. So being really open about both our successes and our challenges. The idea here is to try and foster a community of practice where we're learning from each other so that we don't have to keep making the same mistakes. Um, it's difficult sometimes, and I acknowledge the challenge of being open about things that you may have invested in that didn't work. There's a vulnerability there that it can be challenging in many circumstances. But I hope that the conservation standard starts kind of nudging us as a community into being able to be open about what hasn't worked in addition to what's worked, so that other organizations can learn from our own experience, hopefully leapfrog in innovation and technologies and methodologies so that we see this acceleration over time as a community of practice in addressing biodiversity loss, and we don't have to keep repeating the same mistakes. So the idea here is to share information and really foster that learning environment, both within our own teams, but across teams as well. There is a finite number of strategies that are available to us to choose from. So starting to think about what worked in this particular context versus this one, sharing that information more broadly, hopefully, the theory is building this community of practice so that we're all working together and improving the practice of conservation at a grander scale. So that is the conservation standards in a nutshell. My take-home message, and then we'll take a break for any questions. Accelerating evidence-based decision making does not begin with science. It does not begin with action. It begins with facilitated planning. Hopefully, I've been able to express the importance of ensuring that a planning process actually tell us what questions need to be answered, rather than just trying to jump into a solution space or jump into what the problems are and what information we need. Start from the foundation of setting a clear understanding of where we're at now, then use that as a springboard to say what we want the future to look like and what we think is going to get us there, the roadmap of actions and strategies. That's going to help inform through that process a whole series of knowledge gaps and research questions that, if answered, will give us the data that is fit for purpose to improve the practice of conservation. It is facilitated planning that is going to close the gap between knowledge and action. Specifically, these planning frameworks like the conservation standards that's been designed to be adaptive over time, it builds that structure to bring people together and have those conversations and make sure we are going through a step-by-step process to figure out what those questions are and ensure that we're taking the right actions. And as I've just said, basically, to generate that information that is fit for purpose, to generate that evidence that demonstrate that our investment is actually paying off or not, so that we can adapt, is how we're going to close that gap and accelerate impact for nature and people. A little gift to you. Last week, I released a book called Adaptive Conservation Planning. It basically summarizes everything from this presentation, but in a step-by-step guide for anybody who's actually working to develop a plan, whether that's internally with your own organization, or perhaps you're a facilitator working with a broader team, different partner organizations coming together. We put this together basically just to help the conservation community start this process, thinking about how do we actually get an adaptive conservation plan off the ground. So I offered this to you freely. You can use this QR code to download a PDF. It'll bring you to a little jot form where you can put in some information. And I would love to hear any feedback. If anybody actually takes a look at the book and skims through it, I'd love to get your thoughts about that. But this is a little parting gift for everybody. I'll leave this screen up, I think, while we ask or we open the floor up for discussion and questions. I do have another few slides about human well-being to kind of tie into the nature-based solutions piece, and I think we have plenty of time. But to Jessica's earlier point, maybe we just take a pause here. I've been talking at you for quite a while. And if anyone has any questions or comments or would like to share their own experiences, we can just open up the floor. I'm not able to facilitate because at this point, I can't even see you folks. So Jessica, maybe if you wouldn't mind just making sure that people are being called on in whatever order they raise their hands, that sort of thing.
Do you have to do anything for the mic? It's good. Can you hear me, Josh?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so, and you should be able to hopefully see us now. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you. First off, Josh, thank you very much. That was very informative. I've watched everyone like scribbling notes for 2 hours straight. So I think everyone got something from that. So thank you very much. Yeah, all right.
Is this on? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay. On one of the graphs, I think that I noticed that it was showing the assumptions, but not all of the assumptions necessarily had an objective linked to it. I'm not sure if I didn't read the graph very quickly before it changed. But is that the case, that not every assumption would necessarily require an objective? Or should they all
Very
have one linked?
perceptive. No, great question. So, I mean, in an ideal world, and we don't have any restrictions on time and money, we would test every assumption. But unfortunately, that's oftentimes not the case. Can you still see my screen? Thumbs up?
No, now we can just see
No.
you.
Okay. I'll try and talk through it. If you can picture that graph in your mind, right? We've got all these blue boxes, all these assumptions, they're connected in different ways. And as we get farther to the right, there's the assumption that we actually reduced the pressure and then improved the health of the biodiversity targets or the conservation targets. Ideally, we want to test the assumptions as close to the right-hand side as possible. That will give us stronger information as to whether the actions and strategies are working, because closer to the right-hand side is whether the pressure itself has been reduced. But sometimes that might not actually be possible to test that particular assumption, or it might be so cost prohibitive that it just doesn't make any sense to even try. Trying to monitor that would cost more than actually implementing the action itself. So we move closer to the left. If we can't actually test the assumption about the pressure being reduced, we move one step further back and say, well, can we test these assumptions? The answer might be yes, it might be no. And we keep moving back, moving back. Ideally, like I said, we would test all of them, but at minimum, we want to ensure every action at least has one assumption being tested so that we can determine whether it's on the right track or not. And that's oftentimes just because of constraints, right? Monitoring is not cheap. It's important, but it's not cheap. We end up coming up with one testable objective, for each of the actions. But if we have the ability to test more, certainly, more information in those cases is better. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, we got one more.
Thank you. What do you think about the problem trees or tree problems? Are they obsolete? Because for me, the tree problems always are very useful, but I know that many proposals must be structured with result change. So, what do you think?
I'm not sure I understand the question. There's are you saying part of this is might be the audio, so I apologize. Are you saying a problem tree? If someone's talking, I can't hear anything.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yes, she said problem tree.
So there are many, many different planning frameworks. I'm not going to say one is better than the other, and particularly in that part, like mapping out what the problem is. The conservation standards has a particular set of steps that can be really useful for measuring what or for articulating what the pressures are and how we evaluate them. But again, coming back to the flexibility, there are other ways to do that. So there isn't one right way to figure out what the priorities are that we should be working to address. I'll be honest that I'm not exactly sure of the problem tree approach that you are suggesting. If I saw it, maybe I would understand it, but I don't know it by that name. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is there isn't always one way to do things. I think theories of change are really strong, powerful tools. Um, if we're not mapping out the assumptions on how we think an action or strategy is going to result in a beneficial outcome, again, there's no way that we can test whether that's true or not, and therefore not know whether we're effective. But there could be other tools as well that help us gain that understanding. And the example that you provided might be a great one. I'd have to see one, I think, to really understand what purpose that it serves.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, Nadia.
Yeah, I noticed in the different objectives you shared, the time horizon is 2050. And
Mhm.
given the fact that climate change is happening, we are seeing shifting baselines. Do you foresee that we need to revisit this more often or have a narrower planning time frame to consider to make sure that we are
Yeah.
not over promising even when we think about the range of targets that we want to meet?
Yes. That's the $1 million question, isn't it? So climate change is the wild card oftentimes. And the reality is this particular framework for planning, and there's a whole chapter of this, by the way, in the book on how to address climate change. There's a variety of ways to embed climate change into planning. Everything from just assuming that what we're going to do, if we can improve the health of our targets, irrespective of climate change, is going to help with their resilience against the impacts of climate change. So you can just state that that's the position we're taking and move ahead with that. That could be the decision that a team makes, right up to super complicated climate modeling and scenario planning on what the trajectory will be depending on this climate scenario versus this climate scenario, and have the whole range of options so we know which one to take depending on what climate scenario actually comes true. There's a spectrum of options on how to embed climate change, and that spectrum really from very simple to super time consuming complex. But depending on what species and ecosystems you're focused on, if they are particularly sensitive to changes in climate, that scenario planning might be necessary. We might have to take that approach to really understand what the potential changes could be so that we can pivot immediately, not wait till the change is made and then figure out, okay, what do we do? Right? That we actually have a sense already of what those potential changes are. So there's no single right answer when it comes to climate change. The idea, though, I think, is to be very conscious about what biodiversity is likely to be heavily impacted by climate change, because the reality is it's not equal across the board. If there are some things that we know are going to be heavily impacted by climate change, making sure we are checking in on a more regular basis to see whether those assumptions are true or not. If climate change is taking things in a different direction, we need to stop, take stock of the situation and make sure our plan is adapted accordingly. And like I said, there could be a spectrum of ways to do that. It could just be, on one side, just simply going in and changing a particular strategy and testing whether it's effective. Or it could be on the other end of the spectrum, doing really complex scenario modeling of different climate scenarios so that we know what we're going to be up against potentially.
Perfect. Thanks, Josh. Any more questions? Yeah.
Apologies in advance if this is a little bit incoherent. I was trying to work out how exactly I wanted to phrase the question.
Okay.
I was curious to know if you had any advice or best practices maybe for dealing with objectives, either creating them or maybe reframing them if you're going through a project amendment process, for example, that are based on more of like a social mindset shift rather than some scientific basis, where the
Yeah.
mindset shift might occur, but it doesn't necessarily immediately result in a behavioral change that can be easily identified and quantified. In some sense, for example, let's say the percentage of fishermen who are willing to practice unsustainable fishing, maybe they have had their mind kind of changed by that, but for economic reasons, they won't stop. And that's something that you would want to, it's still a success in some sense that their mind has changed, but for the purpose of the monitoring, like if they're still doing that fishing, then it's a failure. But how to capture those kind of like nebulous shifts
Yeah.
that reflect some successes in your project that can't neatly be seen in a monitoring framework, if you have any words of
Yeah.
advice.
That was very coherent, and I appreciate the question. This is a challenging one. I'm actually writing a second book right now on behavior change strategies in conservation because this is the big thing. It's a myth that conservation is about working with wildlife. 99% of conservation is actually working with people, right? And so it boils down to behavior change to try and change a situation that requires some conservation action in the first place. So the answer to your question is it needs to be very thoughtful. And I'll be honest, when I talk about actions and strategies where we're just kind of hoping and believing that it's going to have a beneficial impact, often does tie back to these like education awareness things. We don't actually test whether this is having any sort of effect at all. It is really critical to map out that theory of change. One of your assumptions in that theory of change is that the perception of unsustainable fishing by fishermen will change, right? So you could take that assumption, maybe flip that into a hypothesis. By 2035, a minimum of 200 fishermen have changed their perceptions on unsustainable fishing. You can test that with a social survey, but your point remains. If there is some other mechanism that doesn't allow them to actually change their behavior, that's not a success. And you need to go back to the drawing board. Behavior change goes beyond just education. It's also ensuring that someone has the capacity to make a change and that they have an incentive to do so, because humans will inherently push back on change unless there is a clear benefit. That's just our nature. Right. So, and it's not finger pointing. I'm just as much subjected to that as anybody else. Right. We have to have a clear incentive to make a change. So true behavior change goes beyond just educating people and hoping that more information creates a change. I mean, the evidence is very clear, actually, that that's not the case most of the time. So I think if you develop the theory of change in a thoughtful way, you are testing that a mindset has been changed, but the behavior has not. At least that gives you the opportunity to go back and try something different. Maybe you need to do some training now. Maybe they need to be economically incentivized to do something different. They get a premium on the fish that they fish in a sustainable way. Come up with whatever mechanism it takes to get the behavior change done. But it's a three-component recipe. It's not just education. This just simply doesn't work, and we have to move past this. It's education, capacity, and incentive. Those are the three ingredients to create change, and a theory of change should capture all of those things and testing whether those three components are working or not. That would be my suggestion. I realize it's so much easier to say that than to do it, but I think it's also really important. Maybe I'll go as far as an ethical imperative that if we're using our career time, precious resources to try and to do these things, that we got to set them up right and not just make assumptions that more information is a good thing and we'll just hope for the best, right? Maybe it will require a bigger investment to make that change if that's really what we need to do. So that's my 2 cents. I know this stuff is super complicated, but I really appreciate the question because behavior change is 99% of conservation. And really thinking about this in a thoughtful way. I think it's important that we all start thinking about it beyond just an education component.
Thanks. Anyone else? Well, maybe Josh, you mentioned you had some slides on giving it like a nature-based solution element. I think we can maybe go to that. And if anyone has a question after that, we can come back to questions.
Yeah, let's just keep the floor open at this point. Any questions? I'd love to hear from you as well, whether you've applied the conservation standards in your own projects, how that has worked. Maybe it didn't work well. I think sharing stories from our own experiences is only beneficial as well. So please feel free to share that information.
Hi, Josh. It's Arjan here from WWF.
Hey, Arjan.
I want to repeat what I told you before, that you're doing an awesome job with this, and DCNA is doing an awesome job with developing this key habitats program. So I'm really happy to see all of that materializing. Not in the least because the open standards are kind of the standards that we use within WWF as well. So it makes it very easy to understand what is happening, what the goals are, what the process is, and to match it with the goals of other organizations like WWF in this case. So from that perspective, I only want to mention that I think that the Key Habitats program and the way it's structured is a really nice, potentially matchable way of doing things. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing the discussion with DCNA and perhaps yourself into the future, and maybe embed it in some form or shape into even more regional strategy that WWF is working on as well. All very preliminary discussions, but
of course,
yeah, that would be quite awesome. And maybe following up on that, the process that you described goes around the circle, basically, planning, implementation, etc., etc. But what you described up until now does not necessarily include like separate planning steps for specific activities, right? Like an advocacy strategy for getting rid of roaming grazers, or a fundraising strategy to get money into the program. So could I ask you to reflect a little bit on how you see that in the context of the open standards process? Where does it fit, or what should you take into account?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for the kind words, Arjun. I think one of the main benefits of the conservation standards is the collaborative opportunities that come out of this when different organizations are using the same planning frameworks. As you say, we can dovetail initiatives, we can understand shared success. So this is one of the major value propositions of applying a framework like the conservation standards. And so I certainly hope there is more opportunity for those collaboration projects in the future as well. To your question, what gets evaluated, whether it's advocacy or fundraising or whatever, is a product of how well a team has mapped out their situation in the situation analysis. If we didn't get down a road as we unpack the complexity that we're working in, where somebody suggested advocacy is a way to address this, then it's not going to come up in the plan. And I think that's actually really important. Sometimes we might have preconceived notions of what we think we should do, but maybe when we map out the complexity, we realize that there's another approach that might be even more effective, and we want to test that one first. Now, fundraising obviously is kind of important to every project, but fundraising for what specifically? Being really clear that this specific action is where we think we're going to drive the most impact. And here's the transparent way where we came from that. It wasn't just pulled out of the sky. We've mapped out the specific socioeconomic, cultural, institutional, whatever factors. And this is how we think we're going to address this particular problem. It's advocacy, it's education, it's whatever, protected areas, the strategies, whatever they happen to be. But at least there's a transparent way to say, this is the thought process on how we got to these specific ones. Once you've vetted those and you've decided which ones are actually going to help you achieve the goals, and again, I'm not talking about a particular plan. We do definitely have advocacy work in the Key Habitats program. You might, though, for any individual plan, realize that an advocacy strategy won't get you to this specific goal, or maybe it will, right? And so we've chosen we're going to implement this yes or no based on how we've defined success and how we think we're going to get there. You can organize them in whatever way you want. So I organize or help DCNA organize based on the specific pressure that those actions are trying to address. One of them is to address the impacts of free roaming grazers. One of them is to address development. But you could organize those in different ways and just have a strategy that's called advocacy. And all the advocacy actions are listed under there, right? One that's called, I don't know, education and awareness or behavior change, and have all the actions related to behavior change. You can kind of lump or split them however you want. But the idea is there is a very well articulated thought process and a transparent thought process on how you got to those actions for implementation. That should kind of maintain that consistency. How you decide to lump them or split them later on to communicate out is totally up to you. There's not really a rule. Excuse me, there's not like a hard rule on that. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
I'm getting a thumbs up, so that's good. Has
Any
anyone
other
else worked
questions?
with?
Oh,
Has
sorry. go
anyone
ahead,
else worked
Jessica.
with conservation standards before? Want to share anything about it? Oh no, good. So maybe this is all new information for everyone. Yeah. You need a microphone. Yeah, but the online.
Yes, it's more for DCNA and WWF. How open and publicly are shared those plans and those actions and goals and objectives with the public?
So I'll start and then Tanika can jump in. Today was actually a little bit of a teaser. So the program isn't actually being launched until next month. And then after the official launch, there should be a lot more publicly available information. But yeah, the timing wise, we really wanted to include something in this workshop. And we thought this was a really nice real world example, especially for people within the Dutch Caribbean to see it. But we knew that this was going to be like, yeah, but now I'm going to have to see the plan, like show me the plan. And that will be coming. Tanika, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so we will be launching it beginning of November. And then, yeah, there are a few things still need to be discussed, but yeah, it will be shared. And yeah, the idea is as well that we will then I'll not go into much detail, but we will open up calls as well for our partners to bring in projects very clearly linked to all the strategies and goals that we're working on. So very much looking forward, working with all of you, because you guys are the ones in the field making it happen.
Arjen, did you want to add anything?
No.
Yeah. And to Josh's credit, he has been very diligent about making sure we've recorded every decision, why we've decided it. We have all sorts of explainer documents. So when this does become public, you should have lots of things to read, and then we'll be around to answer questions. This has been a process. And I think when we started and Josh was giving us a timeline, we were like, there's no way it takes that long. Push it up. And I think we've all been humbled by how complicated this process is. I don't know, how long have we said this? It's been months. When did we, yeah. Yeah.
I'm often sure that it normally takes a bit longer than doing. I intend to do that.
I'm really sorry. Dinika doesn't have a
Oh.
mic. I couldn't hear
Oh,
what she was
sorry.
saying.
Yeah. I'm just sitting here nodding with the mic in my hand. What Dinika said was that we started in April, but it seems like her perception is that this has been quite a aggressive timeline. And I think, Josh, you might agree with that. I would
Yes,
recommend if anyone
absolutely.
else would like to do this, you should give yourself a little bit more time.
That is a really important point. Again, oftentimes we might have these assumptions like this is straightforward. And then when you start unpacking the reality within which we're working, I mean, there just simply isn't anything more complex than nature conservation. There isn't anything more complex. We are in the most complex sector, trying to understand changes in ecology and biology and the socioeconomics that are overlaid on top of that, and psychology and human behavior change on top of that. It doesn't get more complex than this. So we really shouldn't take it for granted. To make meaningful change takes some discussion and unpacking really complex ideas. So carve that time out. It's an investment. Do it now to set yourself up for the next century, right? This plan goes between now and 2100. We have the mechanism now. We don't have to redo this in 10 years. All we have to do is adapt as we're collecting the data and turning that into insights and information. So the hard work is done now to set us up between now and 2100. And I encourage everybody to think of that way. It's an investment up front to set us up for success for decades down the road. But it does take that investment up front to do this properly. There's no doubt about it. If there's
Any
no other
more
questions,
comments? Sorry.
yes, if there are any, please.
Sorry, Jeff.
It's okay. There's a lag, I think.
Yeah, I think we're good for right now. Maybe we'll do the nature-based solution slides and then people have time to think and come up with more questions.
Absolutely. So I'm going to share my screen again. And I've lost sight of you, but if you could just give me a verbal confirmation that you can see a slide that says human well-being targets. You still there, folks?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you see my
Yeah.
slide?
We can. It looks great.
Okay, thank you. So, human well-being targets. This is not something that I actually present all the time when I give these presentations on the conservation standards. This is a bit of an advanced planning step, but it does sound particularly important from a nature-based solution perspective. So I hope this is valuable for folks. Oftentimes, we are creating conservation plans to benefit biodiversity for its inherent sake. But other times we're actually trying to develop plans to conserve nature for the benefit of people. And so the measure of success is a little bit different in those two situations. And this is a process to tie in whether by improving the health of biodiversity, we're actually improving the well-being of people as well. So there's an order of magnitude more complexity in here, but for some projects, this is just critically important and we can't go without it. So I'm going to present it to you here for your consideration. I'm sure most of you are kind of aware of this already. The natural world provides many benefits to people, but when we're planning, how do we actually make that connection between biodiversity, the targets that we're trying to conserve and restore, coral reefs, mangroves, whatever it happens to be, and human well-being outcomes when we're thinking about adaptive management? Well, first of all, we have to understand what we mean by human well-being. So human well-being, broadly defined in 5 dimensions, different sources will kind of map these out in different ways. But at a high level, we're talking about materials for good living standards. We're talking about health. We're talking about social relations, security, and freedom and choice. So at a really high level, these are kind of the 5 dimensions of human well-being. How does nature actually contribute to these? Well, when we're thinking about adaptive management, conservation standards in this case, we are trying to figure out what aspects of human well-being are actually affected by the health of the biodiversity we're trying to conserve and restore, right? So there is a relationship between the conservation target that we've set and some sort of target for human well-being. How do we make that connection? Through the ecosystem services provided by that feature of biodiversity, by that target. So when we think of nature-based solutions, this is basically synonymous. The solution to what? What's the problem that a nature-based solution is going to solve, right? Usually we're talking about some sort of issue with human well-being that needs to get addressed. And by conserving or restoring a target, a biodiversity feature, it will provide an ecosystem service that therefore creates the solution. That's nature-based, right? So kind of flipping the concept of nature-based solution, first identifying what's the problem that needs to be solved, and then what is the nature, the component of nature that will solve that problem. So we want to map out what those ecosystem services are. Again, this is probably not new for anybody. We're talking about provisioning services, could be products, food, water, fuel, pharmaceuticals, regulating services like carbon sequestration, waste decomposition, crop pollination, cultural services, recreation, aesthetics, spiritual, supporting ones, so necessary for all these other services and basically the foundation of life on Earth, right? Seed dispersal, soil formation, those types of things, right? So at a high level, again, there's a variety of types of ecosystem services. What we really want to ensure that we're doing is, first of all, define the social scope. Whose well-being are we trying to improve? Being really clear about that in your plan. Is it the communities within the geographic scope that you've defined for biodiversity? Is it maybe the members of a city downstream in the watershed that we're trying to improve water quality for them, right? Being really clear among the team, the shared understanding of who are we trying to benefit. The answer is not everyone. It's never everyone, unless you're creating some sort of global plan. I've never seen that. We got to be really specific. Clearly articulate who are we trying to benefit so you can actually test whether that's working or not. Then brainstorm those ecosystem services that your targets provide. Now, full disclosure, DCNA didn't go through this process. Maybe this is something down the road. This is super intensive, right? And so we haven't got there yet. But if we hypothetically took our targets, coral reefs, mangroves, seagrass, tropical dry forest and scrub, tropical wet forest, what are the ecosystem services that those key habitats provide to people across the 6 Dutch Caribbean islands? You could map that out and get a full list of all of those ecosystem services. Then you can say, what are the human well-being targets that those ecosystem services provide? What do people get from those services? And so in this example, we have a target. It's floodplain forest. So part of our conservation plan is a habitat-based target called floodplain forest. The ecosystem service that floodplain forest provides is reduced surface water runoff. And if a healthy floodplain forest reduces surface water runoff, then there will be less residential flooding. That's the benefit that people get from that ecosystem service. Again, from a nature-based solution lens, you just flip it on its head. What's the problem that needs to be solved? Residential flooding is the problem. The nature-based solution is increasing the area of floodplain forests so that we reduce water runoff, right? So you're just flipping it on its head. It's literally the same thing. The concept of human well-being and nature-based solutions. This is a simple example, of course, just for illustrative purposes. This table should look familiar to you, right? We actually need to understand where we're at right now. If floodplain forest is our biodiversity target, we need to understand what its current health is. So we have an indicator here looking at the total area. And in this particular geographic scope, they're currently in the fair category at 214 hectares. We can also tie that to a clear understanding of what reduced residential flooding looks like. So an indicator here is the number of flood insurance claims. You can actually measure that. And based on those indicator ratings, right, we're also in the fair category at 47%. Now we have a way of testing whether a change in floodplain forest area results in a change in the number of flood insurance claims. There's actually a mechanism to determine whether your nature-based solution is actually happening or not. right? It's one thing just to say, well, we'll just increase mangroves and more people will benefit. And you know what? If that's what you want to do, that's fine. But if you actually want to generate the evidence, whether that's economic or otherwise, that yes, an increase in floodplain forest or an increase in mangroves reduces the number of flood insurance claims by X amount, you need to have a mechanism to tie those two things together. Obviously, this can get really complex. I'm sure that's that goes without saying, but once we've established what those baselines are, you can set goals. So again, this should look familiar. This is just a typical conservation goal based on the definition within the conservation standards. By 2035, the total area of floodplain forest has increased from 214 hectares to 500 hectares or more within the Pretendia watershed. It hits all the 5 SMART criteria. It is specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's results oriented, and it's time bound. But now you can have a human well-being goal associated with that. By 2035, the total number of flood insurance claims has decreased from 47 to 30 or less within the Pretendia watershed. You don't know at this point whether an increase from 214 to 500 hectares will result in exactly 17 claims decreased. And there is no way for you to know that unless you want to do like a 10-year study to try and map this out before you take action. The point is, get started on something and start to develop the mechanism to test the relationship between these things and actually understand whether this has been a nature-based solution to a problem or not. Because it might not. Maybe you planted your mangroves in the wrong area and it doesn't matter how much you plant, right? Maybe the plantings needed to be done in a different way. Maybe there are other factors that are affecting floods beyond the mangroves, right? At least you'll begin to understand what the situation actually is once you get started and get informed on what are the questions we should be asking. But you got to start with something. And so this gives us a mechanism to attach these two things by improving the state of nature. Are we actually improving human well-being, i.e. nature-based solutions? So the idea, once you've got those goals set, you can evaluate your actions and strategies to determine whether they're actually fit for purpose. Go back to the situation analysis, update them accordingly, and perhaps there are new actions that come forward because you've got a new measure of success. It's not just mangroves, it's reducing flooding. And maybe there are other actions that need to take place in addition to mangroves to actually achieve that nature-based solution. But it doesn't mean you can skip the theories of change on how you think those actions will result in a beneficial outcome, testing those assumptions, monitoring whether that's true or not. So to make sure we're not investing millions of dollars and people's entire careers doing stuff that's having no effect whatsoever. The reality is that's going on right now. Lots of time and money being pumped into things that are probably having no effect. It's worse to not even know whether it's having no effect than to be able to at least say it's not having an effect, and then we can change course and do something different, right? So you still need to go through the whole conservation standards process, even if you're going to go through the human well-being target step, which is why it is a bit of it's an order of magnitude more complex to really map that out. You need a completely different skill set on the team to truly identify and measure ecosystem services that result in some sort of human well-being outcome. So I really encourage folks, like I said, this can be critically important, not only to understanding whether our actions and strategies are effective, but building support for conservation, right? These oftentimes have an outsized value in building funding opportunities and political support on why we should improve the health of nature. But do not underestimate the amount of work and expertise needed to do this properly. This is super complex stuff, right? So be careful that you don't bite off more than you can chew. The worst thing you can do is actually end up with something that it's not fit for purpose, and you're not collecting the right information, and you think you're making a change in which you're not actually doing it. This just takes time. That's just the reality of the situation. If you can make the investment up front, again, it sets you up for decades of success in the future, but that upfront investment should not be underestimated. This is really complex stuff, and I'm sure you're all aware of that already. So that's basically it. The kind of nature-based solution within conservation standards terminology, human well-being targets or human well-being values would be synonymous with a nature-based solution approach. I hope that's helpful, and happy to open it up for questions or, again, anybody who would like to share their own experiences now.
Any questions, comments? It's really interesting. It's like so difficult to link nature to like tangible results for people. So that's really fascinating, and I'm sure makes a very compelling argument to decision makers or funders if you can do that.
I will share too that, this reduces risk because increasingly kind of these broad claims that, well, if we improve whatever component of nature, it's going to help people. We're getting called to task by non-supporters to prove that that's the case. And so I think increasingly we're going to see this more because oftentimes what we're saying is we need a significant investment in whatever it is, forest restoration, to help the residents of this whatever community. But if you can't show that you actually helped those residents, we're putting ourselves at risk about our own credibility as a sector. And we are getting called to task increasingly by, people who don't support conservation or feel like that money could have been spent on something else better, or, whatever it happens to be. There's just different perspectives on how to solve a problem. So I do feel it is a bit of an imperative for us to try and start building this stuff in and make sure that we really are making decisions based on evidence, or we might get caught kind of making some claims that turn out not to be true, and that doesn't benefit anybody. So just something to keep in mind when we're thinking about this stuff. It's one thing to support nature conservation because human well-being benefits. Nobody will argue that. There's medical science that can show that that's true. But then when we talk about specific things that we're going to do in a specific geography, that's when we really need to be sure that we have the mechanism to say this approach is working or it's not, so that we can come back and adapt.
I do have 2 questions online. So if you don't have any questions in the room, maybe I'll ask
Great.
the online questions really quick. And I have to apologize. These were actually asked earlier, but I had neglected the chat. So we have one that asked, for the conservation standard process, is the software, and I might, Marathi, necessary, or do you have any other software that you recommend?
Marathi is not necessary. This is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, so I really appreciate the question. People think Marathi and the conservation standards are synonymous. They are not. Marathi is a software that you might find useful as a project management tool if you're using the conservation standards to design and manage a project or a program. It absolutely is not necessary. We as DCNA have not used Marathi. We have an Excel-based tool to capture all the content, update it as new information becomes available. You don't need to have a subscription to software. Some teams, I'll give you an example. There's some organizations where they might have 100 projects across an entire country, and it is useful to use software like Marathi or Marathi Share, which is the online version, to track progress across a lot of complex projects. But they don't need to do that even. They could potentially, hypothetically, at least do that in Excel spreadsheets as well. So short answer, no, you do not need Marathi to effectively develop and manage a conservation standards plan. There are many other tools available. In fact, if you download that book, at the back of the book, we provide a free tool based on an Excel workbook that you can actually use to develop your own plans. You can download it for free. We're trying to kind of move people in that direction because I think there is this false perception that we have to learn this new software. And for a lot of organizations, that's just like a bottleneck to learn this new software and pay for this new software just to create an effective plan for their project. No, we don't need that. You can use Excel. You can use other tools as well that you have accessible to you to effectively develop and manage your conservation standards plan. So I hope if anybody's looking to do that, and again, I'm not saying you shouldn't use Marathi. It is a very useful tool, right? But if you're not interested in learning new software and paying for a subscription, please download that book, use the Excel workbook. I'd love to get your feedback if you found it useful or ways that we could improve it. We're always looking for ways to help the community as well. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is, do you have any specific advice for applying these processes to a strategic planning for a conservation NGO? We've had many projects, but no cohesive plan, no cohesive program. And I think strategic planning process is necessary going forward.
So probably goes without saying, I'm a big supporter of the conservation standards, but it's not a silver bullet. So let me explain what I mean by that. If your organization defines success by improving the state of a specific component of biodiversity, then the conservation standards might be a good framework for you to develop your organizational strategic plan. Okay, so if you are the Silver Monkey Conservation Group and right, you define success as your organization as increasing the population of silver monkeys, that's what your organization was designed to do, then the conservation standards would work really well. But oftentimes organizations are a lot more complex than that. And even we can use DCNA as an example. This plan is for one specific program where we've articulated the biodiversity, but it doesn't capture all the biodiversity of the Dutch Caribbean. It's a key habitats plan. We've identified 5 key habitats that we're prioritizing, but we acknowledge that DCNA does other stuff and that the partners do other stuff, right? It's not that it's not important. It's just we need to be focused on some things because we can't do everything, right? But we've already acknowledged that, you know what? At some point, maybe some species focused plans would be really good as well for species that we know are critically endangered. We know like the deep sea is its own thing that requires its own planning, right? So sometimes it's not that easy to say, yes, this biodiversity feature is a measure of success. And then different frameworks are needed to really define what organizational success looks like and how we're going to achieve that. I mean, if I can plug my organization, we use other frameworks like what we call the rapid strategic planning process. It's a 10-step process to help organizations, conservation organizations, define that organization level success and really get into things like governance and team structure and breaking things down from like high level goals right into annual work plans so everybody knows that they're kind of pulling in the same direction. So I think it's a matter of reflecting on how you define success as an organization. If you can say, yes, this is the biodiversity our entire organization is focused on improving, conservation standards will work very well, no doubt. But if it's a bit more complex than that, you've got multiple different programs, all focusing on different types of biodiversity. You probably need a different approach to understand what organizational success looks like. But the conservation standards might be still useful for your individual program design or project design, right? And you'll be able to feed up across projects into programs. Hopefully that answers the question.
Well, of course, I work for World Wildlife Fund, and we have our programmatic conservation planning. I'm still toying with the fact of how we can truly integrate human well-being in our programmatic planning, rather than just on a project by project basis. Do you propose that we have that as a target itself too within our conservation planning design, or have that mainstream into each individual results chain?
Ooh, that's a good question. At the end of the day, if human well-being is a core piece of how you define success, there has to be a measure to determine whether the improvement in the health of nature results in human well-being. So you might have it at kind of like high level, some programmatic descriptions to just make that clear that that's your intent. But at some point, it has to actually be embedded in every project and program to see whether it actually achieved it or not. So again, I don't want to like pretend like this is just something that's super easy to do. If you're going to institutionalize this, especially at the scale of an organization like WWF, even a region, a regional program within WWF, that's a lot of work to really actually map out the relationship between an improvement in the state of some sort of biodiversity, the ecosystem service that will get generated by that improvement, and then the human well-being piece. We need sociologists and psychologists and facilitators and mediators and negotiators. Like we need a whole social team to truly understand whether those changes are being made. I think if we have the ability to do that, it's for the better at the end of the day, both from the human well-being side, but also just for the support for nature conservation. Certainly, that's where funders are going. There's a lot more funding opportunities if you can make that connection, of course. But it's not easy. It is really complex stuff, and making sure you have the right people at the table is crucial. So I guess this is a long-winded way of saying no matter what you do, if this is part of something you need institutionalized, it's got to be embedded in a theory of change at some level, because you have to test whether it's actually working or not.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Any other questions? Yeah, coming around.
Hi, I'm Isa, also WWF. For me, it's maybe not a question, but also a reflection maybe of what you just said. We are exactly what you said, starting since 5 years, working with the Red Cross, especially on nature for people. So I really recognize everything you said on that it's very complex, and also that the scale and the scopes are very different if you focus on nature, and then how to measure the impacts on people, and also the part on you avoid something because it's disaster risk reduction. In the sites where we're working, it's not always so. There's not really a baseline. Yeah, maybe in the sense of that you avoid rescue costs, so to say, but you can't really say we prevented X number of people from dying. So it's a bit of a struggle we're currently in, but I do believe it's a way we should go into for nature-based solutions, at least within the partnership we're working in right now. So it's really helpful to also hear you reflecting on this. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, thank you for the comment. I mean, I think, the reality is, like, it's easy to say an improvement in nature results in human well-being, but the reality is, in practice, when we actually take the time to start mapping this out and tracking the relationship, there's really significant trade-offs, right? And we get forced into positions where we have to acknowledge some kind of uncomfortable realities about the relationship between nature and human well-being, and then make some pretty difficult decisions about how we move forward. I've supported numerous teams in this process, and we all get into it really excited because we're going to see how our ecosystem services are improving things for people. And then you get into it, and you're like, oh, actually, this is really messy. Um, there's actually situations where we might be having the opposite effect. And now we have to make a choice whether we're going to improve the state of human well-being or improve the state of nature. Now, that's not always the case, but we have to go into these things with two eyes open and realize that might be one of the outcomes of this process. It's easy to just kind of ignore these things and just make these kind of broad claims that nature and human well-being go hand in hand. But the socioeconomic complexity that we're working often means that trade-offs have to be made. There has to be sacrifices somewhere, and so that comes out in the wash. Again, at the end of the day, it might be a little bit uncomfortable, but it is going to help us make more strategic decisions instead of just hoping and believing and then end up with the opposite effect happening, right? So at least we can pivot if those trade-offs do come to reality and those assumptions end up being true. So I really appreciate you sharing that comment. It is very messy. It often takes multiple iterations to even get the standard of how we're going to track that relationship over time. So it doesn't surprise me that this has kind of like been a multi-year effort, but I am confident that the framework here at least gives us the mechanism to make a claim about there being a relationship or not. And if the answer is there isn't, stop saying we're doing nature-based solutions. It's not, right? It might just be conservation for conservation's sake, right? So at least we have the evidence that we can make those types of informed decisions about how we communicate things and not mislead people, because that is the case sometimes. It is just kind of the nature of our work.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Any other comments or questions? I see in the chat a lot of people have already downloaded the book and are very excited. So hopefully that's a great tool for everyone.
Yes. And again, please, folks, if you do download the book, even if you just skim through it, any feedback you have, really would appreciate feedback. We're already trying to think of like the second version. We're coming out with a Spanish version pretty soon. So any feedback we receive on the English one, we'll be able to incorporate in the Spanish version as well. So please do, if you have the time. I know everyone's very busy, but if you have the time to take a look, provide some feedback, it'd be really appreciated.
And if anybody wants to get a hold of Josh after this session, if you go home and you think of things, feel free to reach out to myself, to WWF, to DCNA. We have his contact information. We're happy to put you in contact.
Yes, I echo that. Please do reach out. Even if a question comes to mind, I know everybody's thinking about this in the evening with your favorite beverage, or you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about conservation planning. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'm happy to keep the discussion going.
Well, thanks, Josh. I think if there's no other comments or questions, we'll let you go. But this was really interesting. And I think we're going to head over and have a few drinks after this. So I'm sure this will be
Nice.
what everyone is talking about. So thank you, Josh. We look forward to continue working with you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for participating today. I wish I could join you for some cold drinks. I'll have one of my own. I'll be thinking about you. Thanks so much for attending.
All right. Thanks, Josh.